Well, good afternoon, everybody. How you doing? Great to see so many of you here live, and I know there are a bunch of you in Zoom world as well. This is great. This is the 33rd Born Symposium, although it wasn't always called the Born Symposium. It started in 1993 when the Institute had a large grant from EPSCoR. It hired about a dozen faculty members. Two of us are left from the incumbents, Kirk and I. Oh, but that's worked out well. It has had several names. I will not, so I don't get in trouble with people. I won't name the prior names that it used to have, but it's been the Born Symposium for quite a while, and it's named for our founder, Hal Borns, who came up with the idea of the Institute. There's a lot of possibly mythological origin stories about it. The one I particularly like is that he went into the president and said, "We should do this, and I want you to take these 5 people and just alienate over half of their salaries into this new institute without telling them." And at least one of them told me that's what happened to him, so maybe that is the real story. But it worked. And here we are, 54 years later, since the founding of the Institute, and still a very successful unit. So we do name it for Hal because we wouldn't be here without him, without his vision for doing this. And he was always here until he passed away about 6 years ago. I did want to just remind the moderators that you have a set of instructions. Are you all familiar with your instructions, or do I need to read them over? You're good. Okay. I don't have a lot more to say other than to, again, welcome you all here. It's great that we're doing this. This is the central event of the Institute every year, and we're going to hear a lot of really great talks about what all of you, mainly grad students, but also some of the faculty, have been doing in recent times. If you are a grad student, in case you are new to the Born Symposium or to oral presentations, I will summarize your talks at the end. They will be a punning summary. We now call them the punnery. They will get posted, but I'll read them to you when this ends. We still have a few minutes. We probably should stick to schedule, so take a chance to oxygenate, breathe. If you're feeling cramped, walk around a little bit, and we'll start in 5 minutes.
All right, it's 12:40, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the 2026 annual Born Symposium. Our first speaker will be Elizabeth Rogers, presenting on their research, Holding Space for Eroded Landscapes and Indigenous Cultural Places, a view from the Holmes Point West Site in Passamaquoddy Homelands. Please welcome the speaker.
Thank you. You've all had plenty of time now to notice that I put the wrong date on my slide. I'm going to be presenting on some work I've been doing related to erosion at the Holmes Point West site. I'm going to start with giving some context about coastal erosion and archaeology in Maine, then review a risk assessment model or methodology that was published earlier this year for the region. I'll talk about some relevant aspects of the Holmes Point West site and then dig into my application of this methodology and taking a multi-perspective view on erosion. And if I have time, touch on kind of some future directions for this work. So in 1980, Dr. Spees made this observation that of more than 940 coastal archaeological sites known at that time, 251 or 26% of them were damaged, quote, beyond having much value to the archaeologist. Fast forward to 2018 to 2022, Dr. Hreineck at the University of New Brunswick did a study in the Western Quadi region, and they found that 50% of the sites they were able to visit had been completely eroded. They also estimated that 65% of sites in this region would be threatened by the year 2100. And they noted how erosion produces a temporal bias in the archaeological record. And this is because Wabanaki ancestors preferred to live close to the shoreline in these areas. And over time, as sea levels rose and shorelines eroded throughout the late Holocene, they progressed their habitation sites inland. So the oldest occupations are closest to the shoreline and tend to be that which erodes first. So in considering the scale of erosion, the number of archaeological sites, Hreineck and colleagues recommended that we need a localized understanding in order to make prioritization decisions about protecting sites, doing salvage archaeology, or other actions. So their methodology involved doing a regional survey and site audits, and then doing a little bit of excavation and comparing that to collections from the mid-20th century in order to get an idea of that temporal bias. And then they did sea level rise monitoring or modeling to understand the future risk. So I zoomed in on just the Holmes Point West site and applied this model, but I also wanted to kind of step back and take a broader multidisciplinary view. The Holmes Point West site is on a southwesterly facing wave-cut terrace on easily eroded glacial-marine clay soils. The landform overlooks a gravel bench and mud flats, and while there are some exposures of bedrock, they aren't positioned in a way that affords any kind of protection to the landform right where the site is. Sanger and Kellogg did a study in the 1980s and estimated rapid erosion rates for the Machias Bay area from 1.7 to 7.9 meters every 100 years. And I'll come back to those numbers a little bit later. UMaine has been working at the site since 1969, but most of that work has been more recent, since 2008. Through our field school, which has been done in partnership with the Passamaquoddy Nation, and we'll actually be going back out there next month. There have also been a number of student theses and dissertations published on the site, including Kendra Bird's 2017 master's thesis, in which she took a look at the effects of erosion on the archaeological record. And I'll be bringing in her data in a little towards the end. So the first component of doing fieldwork or a site audit, since I'm just dealing with one site, my work has actually focused more on desktop analysis, trying to understand and quantify the amount of erosion that has happened since UMaine has been working at this site. One of our benchmarks for erosion has been the spruce tree. And you can see in 1969 or 73, the tree is firmly rooted on top of the bluff. But 2026, this photo was taken last week or this past weekend. That tree is barely hanging on to the bluff. I also georeferenced some air photos from the 1960s and used them to develop a composite or average of the shoreline position at that time, and digitized the top of the bluff and compared that to a modern digital elevation model. And this work shows that there has been around 8.5 meters, plus or minus 1.5 meters of erosion off of the top of the bluff since the 1960s, and less on the western margin, which is more protected. I'm going to skip over the collections analysis and bring that in at the end, and just focus here on my work. My next step then was modeling erosion risk. So Hreineck and colleagues based their analysis on the highest astronomical tide as a baseline, and then added in the highest recorded storm surge, which was from January 2024, and then state of Maine sea level rise scenarios for 2050 and 2100. They did not consider waves in their analysis. However, I think it is important for us to consider waves at Holmes Point West because that discrepancy in the amount of erosion on the southern margin versus the western margin has a lot to do with wave direction during strong storms. So I also decided, instead of using highest astronomical tide as a baseline, I used the FEMA 1% base flood elevation. This was partly because of data availability, but also because Machias has exceeded that 100-year flood level 9 times in the last 6.5 years. So I added the January 10th, 2024 storm surge, which is again for Machias, the highest recorded storm surge. And then a FEMA characterization of wave hazard. So for this area, they characterize as having a moderate hazard or moderate waves of 3 feet or more of high velocity waves. So that's a 0.9 meters added on as well. And then those sea level scenarios for 2050 and 2100. That's all kind of combined into this graphic. I include the current highest astronomical tide line on there because it's a good visual reference for making sense of this information. And it also kind of demarcates the base of the bluff today. So the shaded polygons represent storm surge scenarios for 2024, 2050, and 2100. And then the lines indicate the wave height for those same timeframes. Wave height is going to be more of a concern along the southern margin, whereas the western and northern margins of the landform are going to be more under the influence of the storm surge scenario. So combining these two factors, we can see that by 2100, half of the site is going to be under the influence of high erosive water levels. And this graphic does not consider additional erosion that will occur over those timeframes. That's something I should probably add in a later iteration. So stepping back to our multi-perspective view, from an Earth and GI science perspective, we see 1 to 8 meters of erosion over the past 60 years. That exceeds earlier estimates of up to 8 meters per century. The modeling suggests erosive wave action at 3.3 meters above highest astronomical tide by 2050 and 4 meters by 2100. And for comparison, the current bluff height is 2.5 to 5.3 meters above highest astronomical tide in the vicinity of the site. From an archaeological perspective, Kendra's analysis shows that erosion of archaeological deposits archaeological deposits associated with the earliest habitations have eroded. We still have evidence of those habitations, but we would have expected more shell heap material between what we see and the shoreline, but the shoreline is actually right there in those deposits. From an Indigenous heritage perspective, I don't think I have time to read through this quote, but the emphasis here is that erosion of Indigenous ancestral places affects current and future potential connections between Passamaquoddy communities and heritage places and their ancestors. But it's not just the erosion that we need to consider. Marginalization and systemic erasure of Indigenous communities and their connections to these places happens through our narratives about erosion. So for example, Hreinek and colleagues had this line, and they work close, they have really good close working relationships with Indigenous communities. And this just kind of reflects the bias that we have. But they had a line in their paper that in coarse terms, 2,000 years of occupation have been lost to erosion. But we need to recognize that Indigenous ancestors' occupations of the land were not just limited to their archaeological deposits. Their relationships persist in present-day ecologies, in oral histories, and place names and petroglyphs. We also need to recognize that the destruction of sites and the temporal bias that we see is as much due to colonization as to erosion. Colonization forced the removal of descendant communities and excluded them from being able to continue to interact with and essentially contribute to these heritage places and their archaeological records. So colonization truncated the sites even while erosion continued. So thinking about future directions, there's been a lot of community engagement in place, a lot of focus on this. That tends to be around either public education or excavation, and I want to extend that to collections work. And then also thinking about holding space and creative cartographic and visualization approaches for representing eroded landscapes and also those persisting connections. Maps have a lot of power, visualizations have a lot of power. Let's use that. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. Well, maybe two.
Yes.
What would it take to scale it up and make similar assessment for the entire state of Maine?
Yes, so Hreinek and colleagues did their assessment more on a regional view for the Western Quaddy region, and I think that would be easier to scale up. So basically that baseline model of site audits some collections, like maybe sampling some collections analysis, and then the sea level rise modeling. I think doing like the photographic comparisons, the air photo, I'm sure that with like AI techniques and georeferencing those shoreline or those air photos, that might be something that's possible. It's out of my capacity to do, but yeah, I think it could be scaled up. Okay. Oh, yes.
I guess I have a similar question, which is is there anything that you wish an AI or computational model could do? Is there any pain point that has been identified already?
I don't, I'm not super comfortable with like AI and how to use it computationally. But what I've observed is that a lot of the work around this, a lot of the pain points come into the decision making and the need to be communicating with the descendant communities and the process of actually making the decisions. We know that sites are eroding in regions, you know, landowners know what's going on. So the prioritization part of it is a bigger aspect, I think, than yeah. I'll just leave it there.
Thank you very much. Quick note to presenters while we're switching over slides here. Due to transportation difficulties, Amanda Gavin will not be joining us today. So if you're going after Amanda Gavin, you will be going earlier. So that's just a note. Next up is, if I can open things. Oh. Next up is Mackenzie Anderson presenting their research, Archaeological Investigations of the Material Culture of the Little Ice Age from Long Point Preserve, Machias, Maine.
All right, so my research is based in Maine, looking at archaeology, specifically on the Little Ice Age from 1300 to 1850. Before I get started, thank you, Elizabeth, for talking a little bit about this already. But I want to address the importance of the research that I'm doing and why it is important. So, as we all know, climate change has been a bigger and bigger endeavor, especially in the last couple decades. But most of all, it's caused the warming of the Gulf of Maine, and it's the fastest warming gulf of water on Earth, which is also leading to sea level rise, which is causing erosion, as Elizabeth had talked about. Due to this, we start seeing archaeological sites along the coast lose a lot of that material culture. And while this might not seem like a big event happening, this is to Noor people, this is also a big event for Indigenous communities, where this material culture is part of their history and ancestry, and they have a long-standing connection with it due to the fact that it is their homeland and their connection to their ancestors. With the loss of this material culture, they're losing that connection and that history that they have with the land, and that history that would be passed down for further generations that they want to reconnect with. So my research is trying to look at how human behaviors at these sites, but I want to recognize the fact that these are getting eroded, and it's important to understand this history. So a little bit about my site. It's in Machiasport, Maine. I won't disclose exactly where the site is for the purposes of keeping the respect to the site and the community members. However, my research is looking at the Little Ice Age, which lasted from about 1300 to 1850, although this varies based off the rest of the world. It was summarized by cooler summers with more storms, specifically in New England, although this is not very much known. The Little Ice Age is more Eurocentric studied versus the Americas and more understudied here. So my goal is to continue to look at archaeology and enhance that research so we understand what is going on in North America and specifically Maine, to understand what the behavior was like for humans and what their interactions were with the climate. So my main question here is, what is the human experience of the Little Ice Age? So like I said, it's in Machias. The site is along the coast. I have two specific sites. One is more inland and the other is right along the coast on the shoreline. So I have two sites, like I said. One is the Shell Heap site, which is part of all the land's part of the Passamaquoddy homeland, but this site in particular addresses the reoccurring occupation and presence of their ancestral habitants. It's a coastal site, but like I said, it's experiencing erosion, and what is eroding is shell, pottery, stone lithics, all of that sort is all getting eroded out and being lost to history and their culture. On the other hand, I also have another site, which we call the Homestead site, featuring a colonial settler presence. It also features an old foundation and it has many apple trees. So it suggests that it was an apple orchard and they did some farming. At this site, we can find historic ceramics and building materials. So my two main research questions for my project so far are, again, what were the lived human experiences and behaviors of the Little Ice Age? And a subset of that question that I'm going to be talking about today is what is the representation of fauna at these sites? And what does it say for the climate and environment of the Little Ice Age? So between both sites, these are the artifacts that are present. We have an array of different artifact classes, but the ones that are most present are shell, historic ceramics, bone, building material, and lithic debitage. Although not all of these are recovered from both the sites, there are each and every one of these at the sites in general. The building materials mostly from the homesteading site, while a lot of the shell and the bone and the lithics are all from the shell heap. So my methods. Well, I'll only be talking about my faunal methods today. I want to discuss what I was doing for my research. So I'm doing a mix of faunal, lithic, and ceramic analysis over the course of my research, and they all discuss the temporal and ecological scale of these two sites. So setting the time and space of these sites in history, but then also telling us how humans were interacting with the environment, but also what was the ecosystem like? How were animals and people responding to climatic changes and what animals would have been there in the case of cooling? So to start off, these are the two units from both sites. One is from the homestead and one is from the shell heap. On the right, we have the one from the shell heap where we can see that there's layers and layers of shell. And towards the bottom, you can kind of see that shell stop. I know it's a small picture, but it gradually gets more sparse towards the bottom and sparse towards the top. And on the left, we see sediment profile of the homestead unit. The interesting thing about the homestead is that the layers in the soil are mostly uniform. There are no individual layers that you can really see. So this is evidence of likely plowing, and you can see like rocks and stuff mixed in there, but there's no specific layers other than that decoloration at the end of the unit, likely from whatever minerals or materials were left in there. But otherwise, we see evidence of plowing, meaning that the soil itself is disturbed, and it's a land of farming. They were homesteading, they were growing things and using that landscape. And that can actually tell you a lot, despite the fact that it is disturbed. So with that being said, we'll look a little bit at this data. So far I've found that there are all sorts of taxa along our two sites, consisting of mammals, birds, and fish. While most of them are considerably wild game, we actually have livestock as well. So we have cow, sheep, and pig present at this site. So what does this really tell us? I have to go back to my questions again, because at the root of this, we're thinking about lived experiences and the representation of fauna and how this might be interpreted in the climate and Little Ice Age. So we see two things happening. We see animal husbandry as one process behaviorally happening, and then we also see hunting and fishing as another process. On one hand, the animal husbandry, as we see through the livestock of the pig, the sheep, the cow. So pig, we have a lot of bones left. We have mandibles, teeth. metapodials, those are all representative of the pig population there, and there's a large population of that so far. Sheep, we have a little bit, and we have a tiny bit of cow. Along with this, there's apple farming, grazing, and plowing. So we know that they were apple farming because there's an orchard there. As the apples fall, we're considering the fact that they likely had the pigs being grazed on the apples, as a lot of orchards from our research suggest that they use pigs to graze the apples, which fed them, stopped diseases from spreading, but also made the pig meat taste better in a way. So they would use them at the end of the year. And then again, the plowing. They might have been using cows or other livestock to plow through the farm. On the other hand, we have hunting and fishing. So we also see a wild game. So we see mammals, birds, fish, all sorts of different wild animals such as deer, moose, different sort of fish, and a bunch of wild birds like cormorants, loons, and geese. This also might suggest a seasonality for this area, that people were living here either in the winter or the spring. My indication is that it was likely the spring due to the spawning of fish during the season, because we see cod, herring, and such, which would be suggestive spring spawning. But we also see this duality at the same time of both these people in this area. They both have a presence, but each of them are doing a different thing. So what this really indicates is that fauna reflects this presence of indigenous and also settler presence. On one hand, we have a lot of indigenous practicing of probably using hunting as their primary subsistence practice, with a subsidiary practice in fishing. Meanwhile, we have settler practice using livestock breeding and a subsidiary hunting. They don't need it as much as they needed livestock. So this is only a small aspect of my work. Future work will entail lithic analysis, ceramic analysis to put this in the temporal scale, but also tell us what people were using these bones for, what they were doing behaviorally in the environment. And then I will compare that to other sites in Maine.
We have time for questions?
I've got one.
Dan?
So Kendra, you referred to the site as a shell heap in several of your slides,
Yeah.
but in your list of fauna, you don't discuss mollusks. They have mollusks at this site?
Yeah, they have soft shell clams at this site. Those aren't like what I'm particularly studying. I'm
So
most
you are actually studying the mollusks?
no.
Oh, you're not?
I recognize that in my thesis, but I'm mostly studying the just mammal and fish, other fish and birds. But I'm not studying the shell themselves.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Up next, we have Renee Clavette presenting their research ice thickness estimates across the Juneau ice field from ground penetrating radar surveys.
All right, so I'm going to be sharing with you some preliminary results of ice thickness from ground penetrating radar on the Juneau ice field. Recognizing that the Juneau ice field is located within Tlingit Ani, which is the unceded territory of the Taku River Tlingit people, and recognize and are grateful for their stewardship of this land. And this is a photo of the ice field behind me. So kind of zooming out to global photos or to a global image, this is, I know, a busy figure, but what this is showing global glacier regions' expected contributions to sea level rise by the year 2100. And the circle size are relative to the magnitude of their expected contributions. And we'll notice that Alaskan glaciers are losing mass rapidly, and this is expected to continue by the year 2100 and be the greatest contributor to sea level rise. And so to understand contribution to sea level rise through time, we first need to understand how much ice mass we actually have right now. However, there's quite a bit of uncertainty associated with overall ice volume, especially in the Alaskan glacier regions. Not Alaska. But typically, we derive ice thickness from a combination of geophysical, remote sensing, and numerical methods. And so these are showing ice thickness plots of Greenland and Antarctica. And these are well accepted maps of ice thickness across these ice sheets. And one of the key data sets that helped inform these figures were all of these airborne radar transects in these light purple and dark purple lines that people collected across Greenland and Antarctica. So these transects are known as Operation Icebridge, which was a campaign that ran from 2009 to 2019. And they mapped ice thickness across these two ice sheets. They also did ice bridge lines in Alaska. And so this is kind of a weirdly oriented map, but this is showing all of the ice bridge lines collected across Alaskan glaciers throughout this period. On the right is showing the ice bridge lines, the airborne radar lines over the Juneau ice field specifically. And all of the lines are in black. And so you see kind of these curvy lines, and those are all the flight tracks. And everywhere that's colored is where they could see bed. And so not seeing a lot of bed from airborne radar. And we think this is because typically when we're flying over a more mountainous region, we're getting reflections of radar waves off of surface topography. And then we're also getting subsurface topography as well. That's kind of adding clutter to our data. Additionally, the Juneau ice field is a temperate ice field, which means a lot of the ice is at pressure melting point, meaning we have a lot of liquid water throughout our system, and that scatters our radar signal. And so pretty much we're losing a ton of energy before we can even hit the glacier bed. However, this is helping motivate my questions here, which is one, how thick is the ice? Kind of broadly. But then how can we reduce uncertainties in radar-derived ice thickness estimates in a temperate alpine environment because of the challenges that I just listed? And then additionally, can we use ground-penetrating radar ice thickness estimates to then reduce uncertainties in estimates from other methods? So can we use GPR, ground-based radar systems, to help bulk up our airborne radar and get a better data set overall? And so we are attempting to do this. This was our first deep radar data collection that was pretty expansive over the Juneau ice field in 2025. We collected about 250 kilometers of 1 megahertz radar data. So our radar here is on the right. It's very far off in the distance, but our back sled on the horizon is the transmitter, and this is sending radio waves into the ice. And then our front sled is our receiver, and this is receiving those reflections from the subsurface. This whole thing is like 200 meters long that you're towing behind a snow machine. So we're not doing any crazy maneuvering. This is like, we're making really wide turns here. And a lot of the work that we did was focusing on these kind of larger cross-sectional areas across the ice field. Yeah. And so some preliminary results. Disclaimer is very preliminary. There's more processing to be done to kind of better pick out some of these signals. These are radar grams that I would consider good ? This one on the left is located in the southern part of the ice field, more in the ablation zone. And I would say that we can see bed as kind of this curved line that's going across our profile here. And I would say that because also it has a pattern that we expect, where we expect deeper depths in the center of our glacier as we're traveling across it. This next line is from a higher elevation point on the ice field up here. And we see bed pretty clearly. This is like a pretty good radar gram here. And we think we see bed more clearly here because this is higher elevation. We expect it to be drier, and so we're not scattering as much of our signal in the near subsurface. These are perhaps worse radar grams. Had to show the bad ones also. And so these are both kind of in key areas on the ice field down in the ablation zone. These are important cross sections. However, we don't think we're really seeing bed very well here. And what we're seeing instead are these like really straight line cross hatching patterns. And I would interpret that as being either surface or subsurface clutter. So what we're doing is we're having that radio wave bounce off of other mountains nearby. And that's obscuring our actual deep bed reflector. So some challenges that we're facing. One that was a little more unexpected, although it should have been expected, Typically in radar data, what we can do is we can take our signal and we can put it in the frequency domain to understand what frequencies are dominating our signal. And so we have three really clear spikes here. And you might be wondering, what are these acronyms? Oh, well, they're just talk radio and greatest hits of Juno. So we are in fact having interference from AM radio in Juno. I I share this just because this was kind of entertaining to me. However, and this is also kind of an issue because our center frequency of our radio is at, or of our radar is at 1 megahertz. And so we're really kind of like saturating those frequencies. However, we're at a point where we think we have maybe fixed this problem. And what we're dealing with instead is the clutter. And that's kind of our dominating uncertainty in the radar data. And so this top figure is a raw profile. And then this bottom one is a cluttergram. And so what this is taking a model of the radar wave propagation from a surface DEM. So everything here is bad. All of these lines are bad. And anything that matches up here with down here is also bad. And so we can use this cluttergram and kind of be like, what's not in the cluttergram? And then that could be potentially our true signal. And so maybe we see bed in this very, very small area up here. But this is a great tool because without it, we might have interpreted bed to be like this line going down here. And so we're excited because this is the first time that these clutter simulations have been done on a ground-based radar survey. And so this will be a really great interpretation tool moving forward. And to conclude, one, we can image bed depths of around 1,100 meters and likely more, which is really, really exciting for us. Second, Alaska deep radar is still really challenging. This is we can't get rid of the water and we can't get rid of the mountains. Next, we can, our surface and subsurface clutter are dominating our uncertainties. And then finally, ground-based radar is behaving better in this type of environment than airborne radar. And I do think that there's opportunity for them to be used in conjunction, but as of right now, we're showing that this is a more viable option than airborne surveys in this environment specifically. And so would like to thank the folks listed, funding sources, and take questions from people.
Got a bit of time for questions.
Yeah, Alice?
On the decluttered one, what was the depth of the base of the ice? It's not saying anything wrong with the slide.
Yeah. No, you're good. This one or the one prior? Sorry. This is a raw one. The depth is probably around 800 meters.
Ooh, so no chance to do that. Okay.
Right. Yeah. And that's the thing is like we are dealing with glaciers that like there was an old seismic profile done over the deepest part of the ice field, and that hit 1477 meters. And so like this is really deep ice. Potentially this is one of the thickest mountain glaciers in the world also. But yeah, good question. Yeah.
So my understanding of one of your colleagues' research is that sometimes when we're talking about glaciers, there's an issue of meltwater channeling down and then getting under the glacier. Would that interfere with your finding the bed if you're hitting liquid water instead of rock?
That's a good question. I think it would, because what we would get is we would get the reflection of our water surface because it would be really bright. And so we would get like a larger reflection from a water surface. However, on the scales that we're thinking about, I think larger ice thickness problems, I don't think it would make a larger scale impact as we're like interpreting over the whole ice field. But that's a really good point. Am I free? Okay, thanks, Thomas.
Our next speaker is Mike Goodwin presenting their research, Investigating Global Synchrony, the S-Mark of the South. It's pronounced S-Mark. S-Mark, my apologies. All right, let's get into it. So when we look closely at climate records, especially ice cores and glacier behavior, we see abrupt millennial scale swings, changes that happen over a few hundred to a few thousand years. That's far too fast to be explained by orbital cycles alone, which are slow and gradual. So while Milankovitch forcing sets the stage, it doesn't fully explain the timing, magnitude, or global extent of these changes. This figure here, adapted from Putnam et al. 2023, highlights Greenland and Antarctic ice core oxygen 18 records during the last glacial maximum through the late glacial. Specifically, I want to point out a time period known as the Antarctic cold reversal, highlighted in blue. Pay attention to that. What stands out here is that these ice core records don't quite match up, showing about a 50% positive correlation. This raises two fundamental questions about ice ages. One, were major climatic shifts, including the last termination, globally synchronous? And two, what caused the millennial scale climate oscillation in this cycle? So to explain this sort of mismatch between ice cores, scientists propose two key ideas. A popular one suggesting that millennial scale climate shifts were driven by a bipolar seesaw of ocean heat exchange between hemispheres. According to this mechanism, glaciers in both hemispheres should respond out of sync. However, Dent et al. 2021 suggested that shifts in the southern hemisphere westerly winds drive global climate change. The, quote, Zealandia switch points to simultaneous construction of late glacial moraines in both hemispheres. And this is where moraines become crucial. If glaciers in places like New Zealand and Norway both advance during the ACR, and we can date those advances precisely, then we have direct physical evidence of how the climate system was behaving globally. So, how do we test these competing hypotheses? Well, my study focuses on the Southern Alps of New Zealand, specifically Whale Stream, which is a tributary valley off of Lake Pukaki, shown here. This region is ideal for two reasons. One, mountain glaciers are highly sensitive to changes in global temperature, but also the glacial retreat in New Zealand has been very well documented. So in January of 2025, we conducted fieldwork at Whale Stream Valley, shown there. We carried out detailed mapping and sampling of the large moraine complex that spans the entire valley. Our goal is to construct a robust chronology of these moraines and compare it to well-dated moraine systems in the Northern Hemisphere. This comparison, again, will allow us to directly test whether glacier advances occurred synchronously across hemispheres. A key feature of our study site is this large compound moraine on the right there, which has drawn comparisons to the Waiho Loop at the Franz Josef Glacier, the bottom left, as well as the famous Esmark moraine in Norway. These three moraines are not only comparable in size and shape, but also timing of their formations. Yes. Let's take a close look at this gem of a moraine at Whale Stream. This moraine contains multiple ridges, indicating that the glacier didn't simply retreat in a steady linear fashion. Instead, it experienced several kind of advances or retreats, what we call ice margin fluctuations. It is still hard to get a sense of scale of this moraine, but at its peak, it's over 50 meters tall, so it's quite a large moraine. So to determine when these glaciers retreated, we used something called beryllium-10 surface exposure dating. In total, we collected 67 samples from glacially deposited boulders across the moraine complex. Our efforts, again, focused on this large compound moraine feature. You can clearly see, again, that there are multiple ridges along the crest of the compound moraine. We made sure to collect samples from each ridge. In total, we collected 26 samples from that one feature alone. So, how is beryllium formed? Well, once a rock is exposed to the surface, it is bombarded by cosmic rays and starts accumulating beryllium. So the longer it sits there, the more it builds up.
This gives us a natural clock. We can use the concentration of beryllium-10 to estimate how long that surface has been exposed to the atmosphere. These high-energy cosmic rays bombard silicon and oxygen in quartz. This then creates a reaction and then creates beryllium. Ta-da! This then accumulates within the top few centimeters of the boulder, which we will then pluck off and collect. On to methods. It's such a lengthy process, but here's a sort of diluted version of it. First, we crush and sieve each sample to get the right grain size of the rock. We then isolate quartz using strong acids. Next comes chemistry. We dissolve the quartz using HF, which breaks down the mineral and releases the elements inside. From that solution, we chemically separate out the beryllium. And finally, we measure the beryllium-10 concentration using a mass spectrometer. So in short, we're taking a rock, isolating the right mineral, extracting the isotope, and then precisely measuring how much has accumulated over time. Here is an example of the final step of lab work called beryllium recovery. That tiny little bit at the bottom is the beryllium that we collected. And after doing this for a year and a half, I've really gained an appreciation for just how much time, effort, and money goes into this. It's quite humbling, I find. There is some preliminary work from Whale Stream from Kaplan et al. 2013. However, they focused on the two upper cirques of the valley and mostly left that nice moraine untouched for us. This is my preliminary data set that I've collected myself. Don't bother trying to read it all. I'm going to go through them step by step. So this cluster of ages highlighted in yellow show the outermost ridge and the main ridge of the compound moraine. These ages cluster at around 13.9 thousand years ago. And when compared to the innermost ridge, highlighted in yellow again, while it is only two ages, they do cluster at around 13,000 years ago, which is younger, so it makes sense. Now, moving on to the cluster of recessional moraines, we see a massive recession sort of right at the beginning of the Younger Dryas. And then we are taking a look at the leftward tributary of Whale Stream. While these ages are from different ridges, to us it indicates that the ice had left or was retreating up the valley at around 14.5 thousand years ago. One interesting moraine that I like to point out is on the bottom right there. Shows two ages, one at 15.4 and one at 15,000 years ago, which is Hydrostadia 1, which I find very interesting. Now, there's much more work to come. We are just starting to pull back the curtain at Whale Stream, and I'm so excited to see what the final results will look like. But we now have enough of a chronology for some assumptions. So on the left here is a stacked camel plot of the two main age plots at the compound moraine at Whale Stream, one being right around 13,000 years ago and the other being at 13.9, compared to the Lysefjord and Esmark moraine systems in southwestern Norway. While I admit the Whale Stream ages are a little bit older, it is still within the confines of the Antarctic cold reversal. This reevaluation will outline the formation of these moraines at Whale Stream. We will then compare our chronology to the Esmark and Waiho Loop, as well with other data sets throughout the Southern Alps and Patagonia. And this assumed simultaneous glacier resurgence implies that the Antarctic cold reversal was in fact a global event. And if you're going to take away anything from this, it's that moraines are physical evidence of climate change. You don't need to be a scientist to understand them. And they're evidence that you can see with your own eyes. And I'll leave you all with this beautiful picture of the left tributary valley here. And if you look ever so slightly, you might be able to see a yellow tent. And a big thank you to all who made this possible. Thank you.
Questions?
None? Sounds good to me. All right.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Our next speaker is Pratama Bhati, presenting their research. How do large-scale climatic gradients influence coordination among leaf economic spectrum traits across tree species?
Hi everyone, I'm Pratima Pari, PhD candidate in plant science, and today I'm going to talk to you about one of the chapters from my PhD dissertation thesis on how do large-scale climatic gradients influence coordination among leaf economic spectrum traits across tree species. And we'll get there on what leaf economic spectrum traits are. A little bit background before moving into the details. Climate change is reshaping vegetation and tree functional strategies. It appears to be changing faster than plants can adapt or migrate. And what happens is it's expected to decouple forestry species from climates that they have become locally adapted over many generations. According to predictions, in northeastern US, northern boreal tree species are projected to have reduction in suitable habitat, and many southern tree species will have an increase in suitable habitat over the next century. And the figure on the right are some of the tree species which, based on the prediction, whose future abundance in north and south will either increase or decrease, or there will be minor change, or there will be no change. So since the prediction can only tell us so much about the future of the forest composition, we must analyze and look at individual labeled tree species and understand how trees optimize or balance their resources. Talking about how to optimize or balance resources, one of the key concepts that we need to understand is the concept of functional trade-off in plants. Plants already have limited resources. If they were capable of investing all of their resource into all of their structure and function, they would choose to do so, but then they cannot. So what happens is increased investment in one of the function could limit the development of another. If you look at the figure on the right, on the x-axis, you have leaf mass per area. You can think of leaf mass per area as a stress-tolerant trait, but then it's an indicator of how thick the leaf is or how compact the leaf is. If the leaf is too compact, the CO2 exchange between the cells of the leaf is difficult. As a result, because of that structure, the physiology or photosynthetic rate is already lower. So because of the structure that the leaf has, its function is lower. The function is low photosynthetic rate. That's what the figure is trying to tell us. So when we talk about functional trade-off, the concept that we cannot miss is the concept of leaf economic spectrum. And leaf economic spectrum is a universal trade-off strategy in plants. And all kind of plant have to abide by this rule called leaf economic spectrum. And it is simply a relation or triangular relationship between photosynthetic rate, leaf mass per area, and leaf nitrogen concentration. So if you were to split that into 2D figure in mind, it'll be photosynthetic rate would be negatively related to leaf mass per area, and leaf mass per area would be negatively related to leaf nitrogen, and photosynthetic rate would be positively related to leaf nitrogen. And if we were to further look into details, you could think of deciduous tree species, the leaf of deciduous tree species on one hand, and the leaf of evergreen tree species on the one hand. And the analogy to the deciduous leaf is the sports car. These are the plants that would have high photosynthetic rate and low leaf mass per area. But then because of that, they would have fast growth and short leaf lifespan. On the other side, we have evergreen tree species. The analogy to that is the tank. They'd have low photosynthetic rate, high leaf mass per area, expensive construction cost, and then because of that, it would have slow return and long lifespan. So this trade-off between performance versus endurance constitute this triangular relationship between photosynthetic rate, leaf mass per area, and leaf nitrogen. And that's what actually governs for the leaf whether to live long or die early. Now, the reason that we need to understand or study leaf economic spectrum is because it helps in predicting plants, communities, or ecosystem response to future climate change. And putting this into perspective now, the question is like, how does climate of different sites in Maine affect this leaf economic spectrum traits and then their relationship? So what we hypothesized was for any leaf economic spectrum traits, if we were to plot a graph and fit a line of axis, what we would see was three possibility. There would either be, if you plot the relationship in different groups, there would be three shift A, shift B, and shift C. In case of shift A, between two groups, they're on a common axis, the slope doesn't change. Between shift A and shift B, the slope still doesn't change, but then there's a little bit of variation in intercept. But then if you look at shift A and shift C, both the slope and the intercept changes. Now, in either of this scenario, what happens if shift A and shift B happens, we'd expect trait relationship is relatively robust across environments, and then there is no influence of climate. But then in the case of shift C, trait relationship would still be robust, but then we'd expect there to be influence of climate. So with the goal to understand how climate of different sites affects this leaf economic spectrum traits and their trait relationship in Northeastern US, we planted 12 different tree species on the right across 6 different locations in Maine, University of Maine at Fort Kent, University of Maine at Orono, University of Maine at Farmington, Colby College, Schooley Institute, and University of New England. These sites span 3 degrees of summer temperature and 5 USDA hardiness zone. And we selected these 12 different tree species, of course, based on the future abundance in north and south, whether it will increase or decrease, but also based on the taxonomic group and then their main range that they are found in. And we planted this 12 different species across 6 different locations in randomized complete block design. Each site had 4 plots. 2 plots were planted inside the gap of the forest and inside or at the edge of the forest. And even within gap of the forest and edge of the forest, we had 2 kinds of soil condition. We had native soil and then the garden soil. So each species were splitted or replicated 6 times, and that led to 72 plants in 1 plot alone, meaning that it would be 288 plants in 1 site alone. And if you multiply that, it would be 1,728 plants planted across all of our sites. And for these plants, what we did was we measured 3 leaf economic spectrum traits: leaf photosynthetic rate, leaf mass per area, and leaf nitrogen concentration. And what we found was, to orient into the figure first, these are plotting of leaf economic spectrum traits. In the first and second figure, photosynthetic rate is plotted with leaf nitrogen concentration and leaf mass per area. And in the last, we have nitrogen concentration with leaf mass per area. And then different points are the averages of a species level. And then the line of the fit is at the site level. So what we found, what we did was we compared the difference in slope between each of our sites, compared that with the sites, and then we compared sites with the global database. So in the background that you are seeing, the gray color points and the line are the plants from the global database. So in both of these cases, across all of our figures, what we found was there were significant differences across our sites, and also when compared to GlobeNet, we call global database, there was the difference when we compared between that. So what we expected was maybe environment of each of our local site was playing a role in it. Is something that we guessed. But then to further validate that, what we did was for the same data and for the same figures, what we did, we grouped them into functional groups, angiosperm and gymnosperm. And then if you categorize or put them together into just say it as a tree and compare that to the global database, if you look at the figure in the middle, the slope doesn't change. So the question is, what is it that a site has when you don't bring that into perspective, the slope doesn't change or slope doesn't change. So to our first question, like maybe environment is playing a role, we decided to fit SMA slope of different leaf economic spectrum traits with a mean annual temperature, precipitation, and SPI. Others are not shown, just temperature for reference. We found there is a significant relationship. So it further validates that, so maybe temperature is playing a role in it. But then we had planted plants in a common garden experiment. So we would expect some trait plasticity to happen. So is it within a species trait variation or intra-species trait variation that's playing a role? Or maybe there is across species variation too. And it turns out that from both of the figure, there's a significant relationship. And so both within a species and across species trait variation are also playing a role in it. To scale that into a broader picture and what that means, because of the trait shift or a slope shift that's happening, it means that as climate warms, leaf economic spectrum trait relationship are expected to shift, leading to change in resource use strategy at the plant level or the leaf level. And then responses to climate change will vary across northeastern US, and warmer, drier sites may exhibit a stronger shift in trade coordination, whereas cooler sites may retain more conservative strategy. Because we saw there is an intra-specific and inter-specific trade variation occurring at each of the level, we think that phenotypic plasticity could enable some species to persist under climate change too. And broadly, climate change is not only likely to reshape species composition, but also how species function within the ecosystem. Acknowledgement to my advisors, common campus collaborators. This was a large project undertaking, and the funding agencies and everything. Thank you. I'd like to take questions.
With that question? Actually, I had one. I was interested in how you were modeling precipitation for the area, especially because between different regions of Maine, it will rely a different amount on snowmelt or snowpack, and so that precipitation would arrive at different parts of the season. Did you take seasonality and the changing seasonality and climate change into account in your research?
Right. So these trees were planted for 5 years in the field. We initially had a sensor for recording temperature, precipitation, relative humidity, but then that sensor failed. So what we did, we pulled the growing season or mean annual precipitation from the Prismo climate data group, and then put that together into modeling with the slope.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, wonderful presentation. I was wondering and this might not be something in your field, but this leaf economic spectrum, is there any way for it to show on any kind of remote sensing?
That's a good question. Until now, we're not able to actually detect photosynthetic rate and leaf mass per area through remote sensing, but a colleague of mine is working on a spectral sensor that can help detect differences in concentration of leaf nitrogen within the leaf. And then if you take image from the above, that would actually detect based on differences in the color of the leaf. Like more green means high chlorophyll, you could expect it to have high nitrogen concentration. And then if light color, it would vary in the same way.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Avery Lamb, presenting on using integrated paleolimnological proxies to reconstruct 150 years of genus-specific cyanohab responses to seasonal temperatures.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. Today, I'll be sharing work on how cyanobacterial harmful algal blooms, or cyanohabs, have responded to climate change over the past 150 years. Specifically, I'm going to show how we can use paleolimnological records to uncover genus-specific responses to seasonal temperature changes and why that matters for considering future bloom dynamics. So, cyanohabs are increasing globally, driven by warming temperatures and nutrient inputs. But when we talk about cyanohabs, we usually show images like these on the left, these large green surface scums. But if you zoom in a little bit, cyanohab blooms can actually be very different taxa, each with different ecologies and thus different responses to climate and environmental conditions. So if we treat cyanohabs as a monolith, we may actually be missing important dynamics. Often, temperature effects on cyanohabs are considered at an annual scale, like you can see on this figure here, with comparisons of annual area of cyanohab biomass in the green bars and average annual temperature in the orange points. But a key focus of my research is that of seasonal rather than annual temperatures, because ecological processes in lakes are seasonal. Winter conditions can often affect overwintering and recruitment, spring can influence growth initiation, and summer often controls bloom intensity. In winter and spring warming may actually have pronounced effects on cyanohab taxa that can form aconites. Now, aconites are dormant resting cells that some cyanobacteria can form to withstand unfavorable environmental conditions. So often these cyanobacteria form aconites to seasonally overwinter in the sediment until growing conditions become more favorable in the spring. On the right is just a conceptual diagram of the interactions between possible winter on the left and cooler on the right winter temperatures on aconite-producing cyanobacteria. Warming winters can result in earlier ice-off, increased temperatures, and light within the system that can promote this aconite recruitment from the sediment, and stronger spring mixing that can intensify and lengthen the aconite recruitment period. So as aconites are recruited into the water column, they can often mobilize phosphorus from the sediment and fix nitrogen into bioavailable forms. And in conditions of warming winters, this recruitment can be larger and this influx into the water column higher. So overall, my PhD research considers long-term effects in terms of scale, both spatial and temporal, specific taxa, trophic state, including ligotrophic, mesotrophic, and eutrophic, and seasonal dynamics on cyanohabs. But that is whole scope dissertation worthy. So today I'm just going to focus on two particular research questions. One, do long-term seasonal temperatures better explain cyanohab taxa variability than annual temperatures? And two, do specific taxa respond differently to seasonal warming? So to answer these questions, we actually turn to paleolimnological methods to let us reconstruct past community composition and abundance over, I'm presenting today, the past 130 years by linking sediment DNA with long-term temperature data to identify which seasons matter most and for which taxa. So we've collected 11 sediment cores from lakes in Maine that span trophic state, oligotrophic, mesotrophic, and eutrophic, and NOAA climate zones. You can see 9 of our lakes that we've sampled here on this map on the left, and actually I'm only presenting data from 7 lake sites today, waiting on other data to be available. So we collected these sediment cores with a gravity core, sectioned at 1/4 centimeter intervals, and using lead-210 dating age models, combined sediments into representative 10-year intervals. Within each of these intervals, we quantified gene copies of 3 common toxin-producing cyanohab taxa: Gliotrichia, Curly Dolichospermum, and Microcystis. And just for context today, I've arranged them according to their typical nutrient preferences that correspond to the trophic state continuum that you can see on the bottom. And notably, 2 of our taxa, Gliotrichia and Curly Dolichospermum, are aconite formers. So here are our sediment profiles of quantified gene copies of our taxa throughout the 7 sediment cores that I'm presenting today. Each facet is a different lake, with Gliotrichia in green, Dolichospermum in purple, and Microcystis in orange. The y-axis is decadal 10-year intervals. So for the number that you can see, if you see 1960, that is the decade of the 1960s. So 1960 to 1969. And gene copies are in log concentration. And we can see just by a brief look at our sediment profiles that taxa concentrations, both absolute and relative, are different between lakes over time. But we also calculated our decadal seasonal temperature anomalies using specific lake location lat longs through Climate Reanalyzer. So we used model selection to determine which seasonal metric, so mean anomaly, min anomaly, or max anomaly, best fit our taxa data. Mean spring, summer, and fall, and winter minimum temperatures perform the best, and those are going to be the metrics that I use moving forward. Here we have seasonal and annual temperature anomalies for each lake by decade. We can see some distinct periods of relatively warmer or cooler seasons that aren't necessarily captured in the annual data that you can see all the way to the right. So now that we have long-term taxa gene copy concentrations and seasonal temperature anomalies, we can start digging into answering some of these research questions. So first, do our long-term seasonal temperatures better explain our taxa variability? Well, when we compared linear mixed effects models, seasonal temperature variable did provide a significantly better fit of our taxa data and an improvement in predictive power over our annual temperatures alone. Although admittedly, the predictive power is moderate at best, or moderate improvement at best. However, to begin answering our second question, do specific taxa respond differently to seasonal warming, and also dealing with very strong collinearity of all of our temperature variables, we're using a partial least squares regression analysis. Now, I think this is going to be what I'm known for at Borns, is throwing up really complicated ordination figures every year and having to walk you through it step by step, but we're going to. So what you see up here is all of the plotted gray dots are a representation of the community of one lake in one decade. But because there is so much data on one plot, I've actually just plotted the centroids of each decade with the colored dots, with consecutive decades connected by the black lines. And like most ordinations, the closer the points, the more similar the communities of those taxa are. On this figure, we have both temperature and taxa variables plotted. Taxa is in green, our temperature variables are in orange, and you can see all three taxa ordinate upwards with our summer and fall temperatures, and our spring and winter temperatures are ordinating towards the bottom of the figure. So it's really helpful when interpreting these figures to be able to describe or define what the axes actually represent. So here, our axis, we're going to call it PLS1, is actually showing community change over time, with in general, the oldest communities being on the right and moving towards the left in more recent sediments. So our PLS1 variable was actually highly correlated with all four seasonal metrics, suggesting that community change over time is largely associated with overall warming as well. When we actually plot taxogene concentrations against our PLS variable, we see all three taxa are differentially increasing over time. Therefore, when we look at our large plot here, we can actually see that concentrations are increasing over time at differential rates. However, I think more interesting is actually looking at our second axis, PLS2, or y-axis, which indicates our relative strength of seasonal influence, with our positive PLS2 values associated with summer and fall, and negative, so on the bottom, associated with winter and spring. To get an idea of what those sort of temperature profiles during those decades look like, we can look at the extremes. So our 1930s and 1940s up here are associated with higher summer and fall warming and relatively lower winter warming, or winter cooling in this case. And if we look at extremes from the other side, we can see in 1950 and 1980, we have relatively stronger winter warming over summer warming. So let's look at absolute abundance between decades with stronger winter spring versus stronger summer fall. This figure is showing the difference between the overall mean of our three taxa between decades of stronger seasonal influence. We can see that in decades with stronger summer fall, so on the right side of the figure, all three taxa are more abundant, while in the winter spring, we see an overall decline in taxa abundance. But even though they decline together, they don't decline equally. And one last thing I want to mention before I'm told to clam up is that even though our absolute abundance doesn't consider relative changes in community structure, so here we're looking at changes in relative abundance between our seasons of stronger winter spring influence and stronger summer fall influence. Here the difference is summer fall minus winter spring. And we can see that microcystis is more relatively abundant in stronger summer and fall, and dolicho and glio are more relatively abundant under stronger winter and spring, which does actually correspond to our thoughts of acne recruitment and implications with winter warming. So I'm being told to clam up, but I do, this is just a summary slide of everything that we've talked about, in that, yes, we are seeing that specific taxa are responding differently to seasonal warming. And as we continue to include more paleolimnological proxies into this analysis, we're hoping that this gets a little bit more specific. All right, thank you all.
We have time for a question.
When you say stronger, how are you measuring that? Like, what does stronger mean?
Stronger here is the relative, I think the best way to define this, the relative contribution of those temperatures to the community metric. So stronger winter and spring are just, those variables are contributing more relative to summer, fall versus winter, spring.
Thank you very much. Our penultimate speaker for this session is Andrea Terrell, presenting their research, Alpine Plant Communities of Katahdin, Resilience and Change After 33 Years of Climate Change and Recreational Visitation.
Thanks all. I'll hop right in. It's pretty well known at this point that plant species at the margins of their distributions or at the edge of their ranges are being disproportionately affected by climate change and human disturbance. And in particular, I'm really interested in the Arctic and alpine plant communities found across the northeastern United States. They exist in these small and fragmented mountaintop habitat patches, and they're dependent on their unique topography and climatic conditions found at these high elevations. And so a little bit about their paleo-ecological history. After ice sheet retreat, this whole northeast region was dominated by these same Arctic tundra species that we now find at high elevations. So these are species like shrubs, herbs, grasses, and sedges that we now see in the Arctic and at high elevations. They were all growing at much lower elevations. And as climate changed, they were basically pushed up into these high elevation sites across our region by these forested ecosystems. So if you are hiking any of these mountains today, you will likely start out in this mixed northern hardwood forest or coniferous forest. And as you move up in elevation, you'll enter the subalpine zone, and eventually you will hit the crumults or tree line, where you'll see a lot of stunted trees that are basically unable to grow beyond that point. And eventually, at around 4,000 feet above sea level, you will reach the alpine zone, where we find this strange assemblage of kind of alien-like tundra species. And there's a lot we don't understand about how these alpine communities might respond in the face of climate change, and also increases in recreation and human disturbance. Will we see things like species losses from particular sites, gains of species at particular sites, or just general community compositional changes? Also things like tree line shifts at particular sites. All of these kind of plant community responses to climate change. We don't really know what's going on. But for this research, I am focusing in on Katahdin, the largest alpine zone in Maine that I'm sure a lot of folks here have hiked in the past. You can see Katahdin here circled. You can also see the other kind of habitat islands of alpine across our region, stretching from the Adirondacks, the Green Mountains, the White Mountains, up into Maine, and also up into the Gaspé in Quebec. And so Katahdin is really special because, as I mentioned, it is the largest alpine zone in Maine, and it is also home to a lot of Arctic disjunct species, and also species that are common across other alpine areas in the region. So things like Diapensia might be recognizable to folks. But then there's these really rare Arctic disjuncts like this plant up in the top called Arctois alpina or alpine bearberry that only occurs on Katahdin, occasionally in the White Mountains, and then in the Arctic. So to better characterize the alpine vegetation of Katahdin, in 1989, two botanists, Charlie Cogbill and Don Hudson, completed the first ever characterization of Katahdin's alpine using transects to quantify what species were present. And basically what they found was they classified these 5 different high elevation community types that are found across the peak. So we have Diapensia communities that are dominated by cushion plants that are really well adapted to high winds and low snowpack. Sedge meadow communities, which are kind of these wetter meadow communities dominated by alpine sedges. Alpine heath communities, which are pretty dominant across the mountain. Those are dominated by plants like alpine bilberry, which folks have probably seen if they've been hiking up there. Snowbank communities, which are communities that rely on a lot of snowpack, especially late into the spring, and often harbor a lot of really rare Arctic and alpine species. And then, of course, crumults, which are these really scraggly patches of trees that exist in, this kind of patchiness across the alpine. And you can see in this photo, one of the original surveyors, his head poking out above the crumults. And so in 2021 and 2022, we went out onto the Massif of Katahdin to resurvey all of the original sites that were done in 1989. And we basically, because they were unable to carry the massive GPSs that existed in 1989 into the Alpine, we relied on the original photos taken during the surveys and basically just site descriptions to find these locations. So that was very tough, but we did it with the help of some of the original surveyors. And then we marked these locations with differential GPS so that they can be revisited more easily in the future. And so these are the 16 sites that we visited. They represent kind of all of the different communities across Katahdin. If you've hiked this mountain, you've probably gone to Baxter Peak or potentially Pomola if you've done Knife's Edge. We also did a lot of surveying out kind of on the north side of the mountain that gets a lot less hiker traffic. And so during these surveys, we utilized 1 meter by 1 meter quadrats to estimate the percent coverage of all of the plant species and substrates present. So a general like botany rule of thumb is that the palm of your hand is about 1% of a 1 meter square quadrat. So we would identify all species present and then estimate how much coverage each species was taking up. And generally this was done across 50-meter transects at each of these 16 sites. And so this is just an example of some of the photos that were taken in 1989 that we used to relocate the sites. And I'll also mention that these sites do not have permanent markers because that is not typically something that is allowed in Baxter State Park. So we used these photos and did our best to relocate these sites. And this is also kind of a nice comparison on how different the climate might be on different days in the Alpine. And so our main question here is how similar these plant communities in their composition and abundance are between these two sampling years. And so what I am going to show you in a moment is a map of different Bray-Curtis dissimilarity indices where a value of 0 means that the two communities we're comparing are identical species and identical abundances of those species. And then a value of 1 would mean that the two communities being compared are completely different species and abundances. And so this is a map of our 16 transects, and you can see that the colors that are more kind of yellow or orange are sites where the communities across years were very similar, whereas once you get into the more purple and blue points, those are communities that we would say are quite different across years. And you can also see that some of the areas that are most similar are actually areas where less people are hiking, which is interesting and maybe you can keep in mind. And I will quickly just zoom in on this one particular transect. Thoreau Spring was typically a sedge meadow, so a wet area dominated by alpine sedges. And I'll quickly run through some of the coverage of these species across years, and you'll see that a lot of them are pretty similar across survey years. These are all alpine species that are common. But you'll see that this sedge that is common across sedge meadow communities had a drastic decline across years, and we see a drastic increase in these bog species. So comparisons of these two data sets reveal this kind of patchwork of resilience and change across Katahdin. We see decreases in this rare alpine species like Carex bigelowii that is common at these wet sites, and that is consistent with findings across the region. And then we see increases in some of these lower elevation bog species across specific sites. But overall, we haven't lost any of the communities that were originally found in 1989, but their composition and abundances may have changed through time, likely due to varying microsite characteristics and also variations in trail use. And thank you very much. If you are a grad worker, consider becoming a member of our grad worker union. Thank you.
Good time for questions.
Thank you very much. In the Biodiversity Heritage Library, I think it's through the Smithsonian, it's an online resource. There's a book that might interest you, I'm not sure, but it's by James Walsh. It's the Arctic Plants of New York City.
Oh, interesting.
It's
Yeah, no, that's really helpful because one of my other chapters is kind of about a region-wide analysis of what plant species have winked in or out of different places. So that's very cool. Yeah.
You know, from the paleoecological record that up by Tech or in the lowlands at the late glacial. And when you said that they were forced into the upper part of Katahdin, why do you say forced rather than persisted?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I kind of think of it as tree species kind of pushing up these species into the upper elevations, but really they're just kind of out competing the tundra species at lower elevations. And yeah, the species that are above, or if they were above, are persisting. But yeah.
There's no reason to think they weren't up there the whole time, is there?
I guess we don't know. Cool.
Thank you very much. Rounding out our session, Alexander Roman is presenting their research, Little Ice Age Glacial Advances Found in the Southern Alps of New Zealand at 43 degrees south, suggesting a global extent.
Hello. I'm here to provide an update on the work that I have been doing out in the Southern Alps of New Zealand, where we are addressing the question on if the Little Ice Age in the medieval warm period or if they were global or not, as the drivers of the Holocene climate and the variability experienced throughout the Holocene depend on this. So we have been conducting field research doing beryllium 10 exposure age dating on glacially deposited moraines. And so far what we have found is that the medieval warm period may have been regional or restricted to the Northern Hemisphere, but glaciers globally actually advanced and expanded throughout the Little Ice Age. So just taking a quick step back, let's first define what the Little Ice Age even was. It was a term first introduced into literature by Mathis in 1939 to describe an epoch of renewed but moderate glaciation, which followed the warmest part of the Holocene. And it's known for its impact primarily in Europe, impact in culture with a lot of artists depicting frigid winters. Pictured here is Winter Landscape with Skaters by Hendrik Averkamp in 1608. And he is showing the Amstel River near Amsterdam, which used to completely freeze over during the Little Ice Age. However, it does not do so in present day. So this is actually a modern historical account that it was indeed colder back then. We actually have a myriad of both historical and geologic evidence that the glaciers during the Little Ice Age were much larger and expanded, especially in Europe. Pictured here is the Rhone Glacier in the Swiss Alps. These are aerial photographs from 1850 and 2010, and at the bottom is just a graph mapping the terminus of the Rhone Glacier dating all the way back to 1602 on the far left, all the way to 1977. So the big question from this is that were these advances that were so documented geologically historic, were these just relegated solely to the Northern Hemisphere? So there's a lot of competing hypotheses to explain this Holocene variability. One being volcanism. There's also possibly some changes in AMOC, maybe solar variability, or perhaps it's all just from stochastic variability. All these different mechanisms also indicate maybe what we might expect to see from glaciers globally. With volcanism, you could expect a global advancement during the Little Ice Age, and you could also maybe expect that from solar variability. However, with changes in AMOC and stochastic variability, that's not something you would expect if those mechanisms were the true drivers. So moving into my field areas, I have two throughout the Southern Alps, as the Southern Alps feature highly sensitive glaciers that have left behind these records of the past. And these glaciers also monitor the strength and position of the westerly winds. And they're also located on the opposite side of the planet as the Swiss Alps. We're going to first start with Ilse Stream, which is a tributary off the Cass Valley, which then feeds into Lake Tekapo, one of the great glacially fed lakes on the southern island of New Zealand. So this is just a zoomed in picture of Elsa Valley. To the straight north, there's also the Lucia Valley that we also have ages from. But we're going to just take a look inside this red box where I collected several samples in 2023. What interested us about this location is a picture on the right. There are these moraines where the innermost moraine is this gray feature, and then it's juxtaposed with a pink moraine right outboard from it. So just by looking at it, you can tell that these two moraines were constructed at vastly different periods of time. And the landscapes across the Southern Alps also have this same juxtaposition of fresh gray moraines against these pink ones. So the question is, what is that age difference? These are just some pictures of the boulders we have sampled throughout the field. Those innermost gray moraines are, you can see in that an example of that in the top left. And the further outboard you move away from that, the boulders start getting almost this rusted pink color. And you keep moving further out, you might even start seeing some slight relief in the quartz veins. This is a 1 meter LiDAR imagery of my field area that really shows off the moraines that we targeted in that western cirque, as well as some of the smaller moraines targeted in the eastern cirque as well. We'll now take a trip up to my other location, South Ashburton. Here we collected samples from both the upper and lower portion of this valley. We'll start with the upper portion in this red box. And this was selected for that similar reason, where we found that same juxtaposition of a fresh gray moraine directly inboard of a pink one. Samples were also collected from this lower section back in 2010 by Catherine Ledig, and they have been added to my data set. This is that 1 meter beautiful LiDAR that shows off these moraines that we targeted, mostly focusing on that large pink gray break in the upper section. And then the lower section, just outboard of the actual Ashburton Glacier, there are several moraines aligning that samples were also collected from. So how we did this is that we would find a relatively flat place to set up camp. We would then hike up these large imposing moraines targeting the crest, where we then try to find these large boulders that were in stable locations that showed no evidence of post-depositional movement, that we were confident have not moved and were dropped by a glacier. We would then take a small sample from the top of it, targeting any visible quartz we could see, take it back with us to UMaine to isolate the quartz, and then isolate the beryllium from that. And then from that, we can finally actually get ages, such as shown. This is a geomorphological map of Upper Elsa to quickly take you through the symbology. All that yellow is fan or scree. That pinkish color is from the early to mid Holocene moraines and moraine ridges, while this purple color is from the latest part of the Holocene. So after retreating up the valley, the ice stabilized at the start of the Holocene to construct the moraines in the Western Cirque. Then midway through the Holocene, the Eastern Cirque also saw some moraine construction, and then the late Holocene saw lots of fluctuations in the ice margin, depositing multiple boulders on moraines during the medieval period and the pre-industrial. We also see similar results in South Ashburton. This is using another geomorphological map using the same exact symbology, where these moraines were deposited and constructed throughout the early to mid Holocene. And then there's kind of a gap where in the latest part of the Holocene, the glaciers kind of advanced and started constructing all these other ones during the medieval and pre-industrial. But to make it a bit easier to actually digest all of this data, we like to construct camel plots depicting age populations. So this is from both my South Ashburton and Ilsa Valley locations. So we have several boulders that were deposited on moraines throughout the earliest part of the Holocene and throughout the mid-Holocene. And then there's a gap until we get to that latest part of the Holocene. We have about a few samples deposited during the Dark Ages, a few also deposited during the medieval warm period, and then a slew deposited all throughout the Little Ice Age. And we see a lot of similarities throughout other locations in the Southern Alps as well. These are data sets taken from Shaper et al. 2009 and Strand et al. 2024. And we see that exact same pattern with boulders deposited during the Dark Ages, the medieval warm period, and then a slew throughout the Little Ice Age. And then when comparing all of that to the European Alps, we see a large overlap of boulders deposited during the Little Ice Age, which suggests that the Little Ice Age may have indeed been a global phenomenon. However, we are still left with some outstanding questions, such as if the Little Ice Age was global, what kind of forcings would be necessary to elicit that? Was the Little Ice Age part of a natural warming cooling cycle that then got interrupted by the Industrial Revolution? And were these centennial scale warming cooling cycles unique to the Holocene? Coming back to those competing hypotheses, we can see how my data pairs with each of them. It pairs fairly well with volcanism, since that can account for a global synchronous advance. However, it doesn't really pair very well with changes in AMOP or changes in stochastic variability. And that is all I have. Thank you.
We have time for questions?
Yes.
Let me talk, like, just volcanism part, because any comment like of general thinking, like, why do you need just volcanism? You have a single factor to play together?
So there's a lot of different ideas revolving around volcanism. I didn't have enough time to fully dive into each hypothesis, but the general idea is that there was a lot or several volcanic events that would then put large aerosol, a large amount of aerosols into the atmosphere, which would then cause cooling. Some argue that wouldn't be enough to sustain it, but it would have been enough to at least initiate cooling that resulted in the Little Ice Age. Yeah.
I was interested in the boulder deposition timeline, particularly prior to the Little Ice Age. Does the deposition of boulders in the Southern Alps and no sort of paired deposition in the Swiss Alps imply that the medieval warm period wasn't as strongly felt in New Zealand?
So a lack of evidence doesn't mean that there is no evidence for it. Our group is fortunate enough to have done very extensive work in the Southern Alps. And so it's very possible that there are those moraines that were constructed in the Swiss Alps, and nobody has just touched it. It's been much more focused on the Little Ice Age. So that's what I can say on that matter. Thank you.
All right. Those are the speakers for this session. We're a little bit ahead of schedule. So I imagine things are set up over in 307 by now, but we have refreshments in room 307. And then I would encourage everyone to be back here at 3 for the Dave Clayton Smith lecture by Professor Samuel Haynes of the Department of Anthropology. Thank you very much.
Welcome back, everybody. Good to see a full room. I am very pleased to introduce this year's David Clayton Smith lecturer, Dr. Sam Haynes. Sam is the chair of the Department of Anthropology, where he's a tenured professor. He's a historical geographer. Among other things, he has written a book about the oyster fishery, and that is the origin of what he's going to be telling us about today. Fighting the Spoil System, the problem of securing support for the early U.S. Fish Commission. Sam.
Thank you, Dan. Welcome. Now, is there a way to see presenter notes on it? I mean, I know what I have on there, so don't worry about it. This will be fine. Yeah. But anyway, I want to thank Dan for the introduction, everybody, for the opportunity to talk today. This is a kind of a treat for me because I'm a big fan of David Smith's book on the history of the University of Maine's first 100 years. I read it, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or so. Tim Waring and I wrote a paper on history of blueberry science at the University of Maine in the first half of the 20th century. And before you do anything on university history, you go read David Smith's book. And in reading it too, I felt a connection with the author because it's not an unbiased history. He clearly has a great deal of affection for the university and loves university science. And I feel the same way. So, reading his book, I felt a connection to the author. And so it's a special for me personally to get to give David Smith lecture. So here's a picture of his book. And I'll just give you a quote from this, which is him saying, "Hey, I'm not unbiased, and here's why." From his introduction, he says it's a sympathetic work. His book is highly sympathetic, but that's because it seems to me that the purpose of state universities and the land-grant universities was one of the grandest products of the United States Congress, topped only by the implicit promise of the GI Bill of Rights. Here is democracy in action. So that it's sort of an encapsulation of his feeling about the history of the University of Maine. And I'll come back to the quote at the end. I'd like to draw some conclusions about the relevance of what I'm talking about, and I'll come back to his quote. But anyway, thanks a lot for allowing me to give the Smith talk. Oh, and I can see my presenter notes now under it. So. Okay, so again, a little bit about my background. As Dan said, I'm a historical geographer looking at history of natural resource management and similar topics in the US. And I wrote a book called The Aquatic Frontier on the modernization of the oyster fishery. So it went through tremendous changes in the second half of the 19th century, and I wrote about those changes on the East Coast. There's a picture of how people fish oysters with little tongs off the side of their boat. This is a picture of a packing house with a giant mountain of oyster shells back behind it. It was one of the great fisheries of the country, but it's sadly understudied. And it's surprising how few people have actually studied it. But to study that, you have to also study the U.S. Fish Commission, which is the main fisheries science agency in this time period. They do all the oyster science at that time period, or most of it. So I had to go study the U.S. Fish Commission, which also is less studied than it could be. And so just to give you a quick overview of the talk, I'll give you some background on the U.S. Fish Commission. So what was fisheries science like after the Civil War and for the duration of the first two fish commissioners' tenure there? What was fisheries science like at the U.S. and then what were the problems that they faced in securing funding for science at this time period? And there were three of them. The first one is corruption. That's the spoil system in the title, which was a big problem. People just wanting fish commission positions for the money, for the income of it, or for political gain. And then secondly, the demand for immediate economic return on the investment, wanting to see immediate economic benefit from the research. And the third was aquaculture, which is, of course, a branch of fisheries science, but it threatened to take over the fish commission, become the only thing they did, just turn into sort of a hatchery science operation. So those were the three main threats to funding for it. And I'll tell you the methods I used for the study, just in case this kind of thing interests you. If you want to study the early Fish Commission, you have to go to the National Archives. All their reports to Congress are in the Library of Congress, but they're now all digitized too. And all of their bulletins, the actual output of their science, is also in the Library of Congress and now digitized. You can just look it up online. I had to go to DC, to actually photocopy all of that, but now it's just online. But if you want to really understand what they were doing and really understand the problems they faced, that's only in their correspondences. You have to go to that room at the National Archives, the big reading room, and make an appointment. They bring out your carts with all of your boxes of letters, and you pull out all of their correspondences. And you find out what they really thought about things, and that's where all of this comes from, is from working at National Archives, in that big room right there, with their correspondences. And it's amazing that still exists. It's such an amazing resource for researchers. Every letter that was sent to them, they kept. And every letter they sent out, they kept as carbon copies. You all are familiar with carbon copy paper? Right? And it's carbon copies from 1874, and it still exists, and you can still read it, which is kind of phenomenal that it doesn't just disintegrate, but that's what you're reading, is these old carbon copies of Fish Commission letters, are the letters coming back. And 99 out of 100 are receipts for a telescope or something like this. But the others, you have to hunt through it, but then the others are the actual correspondences. You can see everything they were talking about and doing and strategizing about. Okay, so the first part of the talk then, and after I do this part, I'll reflect a little bit on, well, what can we learn from this, if anything, for challenges of science funding today? Okay, so just a little background on the U.S. Fish Commission. These are the first two commissioners, Spencer Fullerton Baird and George Brown Good. And Baird was also the assistant secretary for the Smithsonian before this period, where he was one of the leading fisheries scientists in the country. And the U.S. Fish Commission was the leading fisheries and marine science agency at its inception. That's where most marine science was done. But when it was created, it was part of a whole cluster of agencies and new scientific institutions that were created during and after the Civil War. The USDA in 1862, the Land Grant Colleges in 1862, the National Academy of Sciences is 63, I believe. The U.S. Forest Service really starts in 76. Then you have U.S. Geological Service in 78. So there's all this institution building for scientific institutions and university science institutions that takes place this time, including University of Maine as one of the land grant institutions. And these all built on earlier concepts in some way, but it's worth remembering that the Civil War created, in the aftermath of that, the Reconstruction after that, created one of the greatest bursts of scientific institution building in American history. The Fish Commission was fishery science before that. A lot of it had been Baird and Louis Agassiz of Harvard. Their collecting efforts, especially in the 1850s, was sort of what fishery science was like before the Fish Commission. So it did build on their work. When it was created, the Fish Commission was intended to be temporary. It was if you read the act, it says it's going to make a report, singular. And it doesn't say how long it's going to take, but it's clearly meaning to be something that was temporary, and Baird wanted it to be that. But then immediately the people decided, both him and other stakeholders decided to make it into a permanent entity. But when it was created, there was no expectation it was to be permanent, and it could have gone away. People could have made it, go away if it lost congressional funding really at any time. So its early existence was tenuous. And it was founded because there was a widespread recognition that fish stocks were declining and that we needed to do something about this. We had to study the cause of fisheries depletion and go out and make scientific solutions and get scientific knowledge on what was causing fish stock decline. Okay, so that background on it. Let's get to what do you find in the correspondences, and what were the threats to this? And the first one was the spoils system, which was people wanting jobs at the Fish Commission just for the salary, or to use it as a stepping stone to some kind of political office. And this was the most common problem identified in the archives, partly because of this, it was a really serious problem, but also because the only way they had to deal with it was to write letters to the Fish Commissioner, and the Fish Commissioner could block these people from appointment or try to do that in some of the state commissions. So they had to have this constant correspondence about who's corrupt and who's not, going back and forth with the Fish Commissioner. And this will give you some of the these are very entertaining to read because they really are very personal about these people they don't like. He's a lame person without much scientific knowledge. The U.S. Fish Commission, the New York Fish Commission was just a political machine at this point. They're saying nobody in there is doing any science. They're all just trying to get the salary. And poor Blackford, I have no faith in Blackford. It's simply outrageous to make the office the prey of spoilsmen. Or Ferguson gets mentioned a lot. The man we have to fear is Major Ferguson. He needs to be watched. Anything I can do to thwart him, rely on me. Or he's just using it for a convenient duck hunting ground. He just wants this job so he can have a nice hatchery on the coast to hang out and go hunting. This one is from a naval officer who had to work and assisting the Fish Commission. The person he assisted was totally corrupt, and he's saying, well, experience has taught me that he just uses it for his own ends. This naval officer refused to work with that Fish Commission employee. The Fish Commissioner said the law says you have to work for him, so then he took that guy and did everything he could to thwart his efforts. So, and my favorite example of this kind of corruption that was happening in fisheries, science of fisheries at this time was in the oyster fishery in Chesapeake Bay. They formed law enforcement agencies in 1868 to prevent overfishing. And the wealthy oyster packers who were making all the money by overfishing tried to assassinate the head of the oyster navy. But he was a wily Civil War veteran and knew how to thwart them and and escape being killed. So they said, well, let's go to the legislature and get someone to replace him, and then we'll just bribe that guy. We'll get someone more bribable, and we'll say, we're going to go overfish over here, and he'll go over that way. So that was what they did. We couldn't kill him, so we'll just get a corrupt person. And so anyway, it's kind of colorful, but this was constant in the letters of just who's who and who do we have to stop. The fear of it was that if it's taken over by people, they're just in it for the money, that the fisheries science will, of course, collapse. And when they talked outwardly, they wouldn't say, so I want to hire so-and-so or I'm not going to hire so-and-so because he's corrupt. They would say, he's not a good scientist. He hasn't published enough. And they would use how much science you publish and your quality as a scientist as sort of the outward way of talking about this. Anyway, and they were involved in, couldn't appoint people to the state commissions, but they also kept an eye on that and tried to lobby for certain people being appointed there. And they were successful at dealing with this. The second one is more kind of less colorful and more mundane, which is just immediate economic benefits. There's a lot of correspondences where they say we have to stay on message essentially and keep telling people that the basic science that we're doing is the foundation for sustainable and profitable management. Therefore, if we don't do the basic science on fish natural history, it may look like it's irrelevant in the short term, but in the long term, that's what's going to put fisheries in the United States on sustainable footing and lead to more money in the long run. So they were in favor of economic benefits. It was created for that, but it was more of, we have to do the basic science to achieve the long-term benefit. And we have to keep on message about keep promoting that message to constituents, to the fishermen and to other stakeholders. So this comes up quite a lot, and it's just some examples from Marshall McDonald when he was an employee before he became the fish commissioner. And the aquaculture was a bit more of a complex relationship, and that aquaculture was something the Fish Commission did right from the start, but it threatened to take over the whole enterprise, and it became just a sort of hatcheries-based scientific endeavor that didn't look at all these other kinds of marine science and natural history. Again, I'll talk about the oyster fishery just for a second, because it was the most advanced kind of aquaculture at the start of the Fish Commission. It was the first big aquaculture fishery in the U.S. You catch oysters. This is how you catch them, with these little rakes. You go on shallow boats and skiffs in shallow bays, and you catch the oysters, not in the summer when they're small and fragile, but the other 9 months of the year. And that's what it looks like. Whereas aquaculture in the 1870s, 1880s looked like this in Long Island Sound. They were leasing property off of the, so it looks sort of like farms where you have oyster farms where it's all leased. Looks very organized and progressive compared to oystermen out with their little tongs. They would take out barges and take the shells and put out large quantities of shells and then seed oysters and create massive artificial reefs. This boat was the largest of the harvesting boats. It's a steamship that did nothing but harvest oysters off of private farm. So again, industrial scale aquaculture. So a lot of people looked at this and said, well, this or this is anachronistic and backwards. This is clearly the future. And so there was an example when the Fish Commission started of highly sort of a large scale aquaculture out there that inspired a lot of people to think that aquaculture was the wave of the future, and the Fish Commission should focus pretty much exclusively on that. And there were also two associations that were formed right after the Fish Commission. There was the American Fish Culture Association and the National Shellfish Association, which were essentially lobbying agencies that were formed by the wealthy people in these industries and often had members of government or some prominent scientists that would be members. But they were meant to lobby both the government and for policy. So we should have more releases of areas for aquaculture, but also lobby for science and steer science more towards aquaculture. And so these are groups that were successful and had an impact on the Fish Commission work, and but didn't totally take it over. But they, even by the second year, as soon as the American Fish Culture Association is formed, it lobbies Congress to increase funding for the U.S. Fish Commission and to use that funding for hatcheries. And so right away, there's this emphasis on steering it in that direction. So there was, in the correspondences, there's sort of an ambivalent relationship in that they're worried about this taking over, and yet they see the need to do it, and they want the funding and the political support, but they're also worried that it could take over and sort of become the main thing that they did. In the oyster case too, these farms all collapsed because it created a giant monoculture of oysters, and it created big invasions of starfish and drumfish that wiped it out. And in this time period, it was a very enticing model of what the future of the fisheries could be if we applied science to aquaculture more exclusively. Okay, so just to give you my assessment of it, I think that the Fish Commission was very successful at dealing with all three things. That they managed to keep the Fish Commission from becoming like the New York Fish Commission was. They managed to keep it something where they kept this at a minimum, the problem of corruption or spoilsmen at a minimum. They kept making that argument for long-term scientific studies and basic science. And if you look at the bulletin, the Fish Commission bulletin, they kept doing that kind of science throughout this time period. So they made that argument successfully enough to continue on with that. And then aquaculture was, it's all there in the bulletins. It's something they definitely did, but they kept it in bounds as well. And again, if you look at the actual science that they created, there's plenty of science on basic science the way they wanted it to be at its inception. So it is a case of where science funding was heavily threatened, but they were very successful at navigating that. Okay, so for the final part of the talk, I just wanted to look at this a little bit and say, what can we learn from this episode as far as our current predicament with science funding, or current crisis in science funding. So certainly this is a difficult time period, and what can we learn from the past in terms of looking at that? And so what I learned from this anyway, I think we all learn different things from looking at the past, but what I learned from this is partly from my own research on the Fish Commission and what I presented today, but also for thinking about the history of environmental science institutions in the U.S. in general. I don't know anything about medical science history or anything like that, but the history of natural resource and environmental science institutions. But also, the things that I take away from this are also from David Smith's book. I'm a big fan of the book. I think if you work at the University of Maine, it should be required reading for faculty. You should know your university's history. And for the talk, I had to re-engage them back and reread it and remember how much I liked it. But so for what I take away from this is partly from my own research, it's partly from my knowledge of natural resource institution history, but also from Smith's book, my engagement with that. And so I'll just leave you with a couple of thoughts about that. The first is that in university science institutions, that crisis has been the biggest driver of change. If you remember that quote I had at the beginning from Smith about, two of the greatest things Congress ever did were the Morrill Act and the GI Bill. what did those come out of? The Civil War and the Great Depression and World War II, right? They were the biggest changes in sort of university science model were driven by our two biggest crises. And so I think that's, fairly obvious, but it's worth remembering that. We get inundated with people telling us that other things are going to drive change. Technology is going to be what drives change in particular, or changes in demographics or larger social changes or something like that. When we've made major changes at university, we've certainly responded to those things. We've responded to new professional needs and new demographics and new technology. But did the technology actually, was that the impetus for change? Not in the biggest changes in our university. Those were driven by crisis. People used to think the television was going to really be the thing that revolutionized the university. And then it was the VCR and the television. That's going to clearly replace lectures. And I think of that example because we were just updating the student lounge in anthropology. We're giving them a bigger room. It's a sunnier room, but I had to clear out the old TV and VCR. And I thought, well, the students' need for contact with each other and contact for us, that still remains. The TV and VCR are going to resource recovery. So crisis drives change in university science institutions, at least our biggest change. That's what's driven it. And if you look at those two biggest changes, what Smith was talking about in the introduction, the Morrill Act and the GI Bill are driven by our two biggest crises. But we were extremely successful as a country at in terms of university science, and what we built in response to those crises. I mean, think about that. We built the Civil War. In the middle of it, we initiated the land grant institutions. And then after the Civil War, after World War II, the GI Bill, and then the National Science Foundation as well, and other things in that sort of second cluster. And it wasn't just the Morrill Act, it was a whole cluster of things we built along the US Fish Commission too. The whole cluster of these new scientific institutions that came out of this time period of profound crisis and rebuilding. So this is true, and doing this reminded me of this, and looking at Smith's book and reading his quote where he pulls these things out and talks about democracy in action as to how we have dealt with those crises and what we built. But I feel like what does that tell me to do other than sort of my civic duty? But what does it tell me to do at the university? I don't know. I don't know that tells me anything to do. I'm not sure. But the third thing I drew out of really engaging Smith's book carefully and reading it carefully was the Great Depression, and as a sort of model, what did we do during the Great Depression at University of Maine? So if we're going to go through a very difficult financial time period, which we are, if you've seen the president's presentation on the budget, they did that before the Iran war and whatever that's going to do. So whatever that's going to do to inflation is not in that estimate. It's worse than that, right? It's going to be, that's an overly optimistic estimate. So if we're going to go through a very difficult time period financially, what did we do last time we went through an even bigger, most dire financial crisis we've had at the university, which is the Great Depression? And I was really struck by what we actually did. I didn't know. And so reading Smith's book was quite fascinating. We went in the worst parts, like 30 to 34. We had big faculty pay cuts, so that was something we did. And but we also had a 2-year conversation with consultants from Columbia who came in to talk to us about how you re-envision the university and rethink a lot of your organization. Their number one complaint about how we were organized was our libraries. Your library budget is way, way too low. So some things don't change much, apparently, for durable sort of historical trends. But what we did after that was even more interesting. And again, these are the worst years of the Depression for us. We then had a process that I really want to know more about at the college level, where the colleges said, let's get together and rethink our curriculum. And they suggested a whole bunch of curriculum changes, which Smith then says we implemented in the late 30s, which then got kind of delayed by the war when half our students were gone. But those set us up really well for the GI Bill NSF University that followed. And so what we did in the 30s really laid the groundwork for our success. So it's fascinating to me that in our worst financial crisis in our country's history, in the university's history, faculty got together collectively and said, how do we re-envision our curriculum? That's not intuitive. Why curriculum change isn't going to fix your financial crisis. But yet that's what we did. We turned back to the students and said, you're going through this too. Let's try to help you out and build something that's new. As Smith puts it, we we asked, who are we going to teach and how are we going to teach? Anyway, I want to learn much more about that. I don't know enough about that particular initiative and would like to learn a lot more about it. But I think in general, what I took away from engaging with this talk and re-engaging with Smith's book, which I think is a great book, it really gave me something I think I'm going to do, which is let's use this as a model. I'm going to redouble my efforts to engage with my colleagues on curriculum change and put the students first and really try to help the students get through this. And that's what we did in the Great Depression. Let's do that again. I want to reinvent the wheel. And if it worked for them, then yeah, maybe that works for us too. That doesn't help us with the financial side of it, but it sets us up for success when the financial winds change, and that's what they did during the Great Depression. So anyway, thank you for the opportunity to give the talk, but it made me re-engage with Smith's book, and that's given me something really useful to think about, something I think I can use in the years to come here. So thank you very much. You can't see it, but there's little bitty stakes out there where somebody has a little old aquaculture farm so it's from an old aquaculture report, but you can't really see it. But trust me, there's a little bit of aquaculture out there.
So we have time for some questions. I'm going to start. I have a comment and a question. My comment is one takeaway from your talk is that despite how different our world is from the late 19th century, there's real truth, sadly, to the saying that the more things change, the more they stay the same. I'm thinking particularly about corruption, which we are seeing, and the desire for instant gratification in return for investment in science or anything else. Sad but true. My question is a whole different thing. You mentioned using the shells, and you showed a picture of a pile of shells on a boat to seed oyster beds, but I wonder if they use them for anything else. I'm inspired in this question by time I spent in Honduras in 1981, where I saw somebody collecting oyster shells from the bottom of a lagoon, and he sold them to farmers, he said, so that they could feed them to the chickens and get stronger eggshells. Do you know of any other uses for these shells besides seeding oyster beds?
The oyster, interestingly, was a heavily legislated fishery. It was the most heavily legislated fishery early on because the oysters are close to the shore where you can see what people are doing, and you can create oyster territories and you can have laws and enforce them. And so by the time of the U.S. Fish Commission, there was voluminous oyster law up and down the East Coast, and sometimes there were informal property systems and things like that too. But one of the things that the laws contained in every state were prohibitions on using oysters for line, because it was used for agricultural purposes. And so you could buy it from the packing house or the cannery, but you couldn't harvest oysters for that. So there was restrictions on it. But yeah, it was used as agricultural line, but there were careful restrictions on it. You couldn't just go down and harvest oysters just for that and sell them for that purpose. And it was common enough practice to be banned in every state. So.
But as long as they had been harvested for food, then the leftover shells could be used.
Yeah.
I recall another ethnographic experience in Peru was not oysters, but other shells, burning them into a powder because it made a better calcium carbonate to chew with the coca leaves to get better effect from them. They liked it better than rock lime.
There were also laws.
Chew coca up here, though.
There were laws, coal laws as well in every state, where when you harvested the oysters, you had to throw back the dead ones. So you're supposed to pull them up on deck and look, and if some are just empty shells, you're supposed to throw all the empty shells back, because when you're taking the oyster away, you're removing the substrate for the other, the larval oysters to attach. They have to attach to something solid. If they land in the mud, they just die. So when you harvest up the oysters, you potentially can get rid of the substrate for the next generation of oysters. So all the states also had coal laws where you had to throw back all the shells you found to create that substrate again, keep the oyster reef intact.
Other questions?
Where else did they do aquaculture on an organized way, the way you showed in the Long Island Sound? Did they do that in Chesapeake Bay too?
In Europe, they had a highly developed aquaculture system for oysters, but it was on the shores, like pond-based. And they tried in the 1850s to develop an offshore one, and the government heavily invested in what was the biggest aquaculture experiment to history to that date, and huge oyster farms they created all up and down the French coast, which got wiped out and mostly went away. But the French had an elaborate pond system. The only place that had large-scale aquaculture in the U.S., other than that, the Long Island Sound one was unique. That was the biggest example of that. There was quite a bit in Delaware Bay. Delaware Bay has, if you start at the top and you go down towards the coast, all the oyster reefs are up at the top because it's lower salinity and their predators aren't there for the young oysters. So the bottom part, you can grow oysters, but there's not as many oyster reefs. So they would harvest them in the top and sell them to oyster aquaculturists down at the bottom. So it kind of divided the bay in half where, and again, the adult oyster can survive, but the baby oysters get eaten up. And so it's perfectly good for growing oysters in lower Delaware Bay, but there weren't oysters there. And so they could just kind of divide up the bay and have half of it for the natural beds, they called it, another half would be the aquaculture. But it wasn't as industrial or as large scale as what you had in Long Island Sound. And that dividing up the bay was done in other places too. Barnegat Bay in New Jersey, Great Bay in Long Island. There were other places that could divide it. The problem with the Chesapeake is there were so many oysters in so many places that there was no way to divide it up. It was the biggest oyster beds in the country, and they were just everywhere. So there was no place that you could just have oyster aquaculture that someone wasn't already fishing oysters. And those people wanted their property rights. They didn't want your farm taking away their oyster tonging grounds. And so there was a long-running battle by people in government and some of the U.S. Fish Commission scientists to try to institute oyster aquaculture in the Chesapeake Bay. That didn't really work. It was really fought off by the fishermen because they didn't want to lose their traditional territory and fishing grounds. And it's a fascinating story of like how they tried, the people trying to institute oyster aquaculture and the people fighting it, and it's just
So for the Great South Bay,
Mhm.
I understood as a boy growing up, my father's uncle was a bayman, going out and he clammed with tongs and all that stuff. And so I learned about the Blue Point Oyster Company, and I understood that the Great South Bay was granted to them in the 1600s by the Queen of England, and they retained rights to the bay, to a good part of it, up until around 1980, I think. And so the middle part of the bay was Blue Point, and around the fringes is where everyone else could go. And they didn't just seed oysters, they seeded clams too, quahogs, mercenaria. Is that true that was only controlled by that one company, the Great South Bay, or?
Oh, I'd have to go check. I mean, I don't remember that level of detail. Yeah, I'd have to go check. I don't know. That's fascinating. But some of these, there are some. Yeah, no, I'd have to go check for sure.
I know we've got some other questions. In the spirit of David Smith, for those of us who knew him, he, among other things, he's a great fan of the Marx Brothers who did the comic movies. And has anybody seen Horse Feathers besides me? Okay. I have to ask you if the Chesapeake Bay oyster farmers who use the tongs fought with each other like the people, there's lobster fishermen that Jim Atchison used to talk about. And if so, did they have tong wars?
Yes. It's a part of that, I guess. So they did fight with each other. There were also, because each town had their own territory, and the territories, and if you look at the law, could be very complicated. And it would be sort of like, okay, we're not your territory isn't the York River, it's some ill-defined area near where you live, or it can be, next this church steeple from that rock, to this point is our territory in our town. Like, how do you, and then, oh, the church burned down. Now, where is your territory? And so some of the territories were very complicated and ill-defined, or they overlapped with other territories. And so there was definitely conflict. In the Chesapeake Bay, they had much more conflict, though, with illegal harvesters. Illegal harvesters used a different technology, which was the dredge, which is a bigger boat that you pull like a schooner, and you pull a dredge, and you're dredging was banned everywhere. Schooners, large boats were banned everywhere in every state because it was just rich people scooping up all the oysters and taking them back to the packing houses. And so to keep the oysters controlled by local people and to spread out the harvest and support the towns, they banned tongs and dredges. So in the Chesapeake, they had long-running battles with dredgers, sometimes actual gun, shooting each other. Before the Civil War, before they had the oyster navies, they would enforce the law by forming a posse. They'd find oyster dredgers, which might be 6 or 8 boats or something. The fishermen would come to the sheriff. The sheriff would deputize all these fishermen. They'd all get guns. They'd get in their boats. They'd go out and they'd try to capture the dredge boats. And the penalties were very stiff. Your boat would be sold at auction, this kind of thing. But yeah, they had bigger, they did have territorial disputes, but their bigger clashes were, armed clashes were more with the illegal dredgers.
So there's a increased with community. Okay, so kind of going to your point about community opposition to aquaculture, we're seeing in Maine a handful of communities trying to pass or having successfully passed outright bans of aquaculture farms in their coastal territories. I'm curious if you could, on the basis of primarily it seems like environmental considerations, the harmful algal blooms and industrialization of marine habitats and things like that. I'm just curious what we can learn from history and how aquaculture has either addressed those concerns or overcome community opposition and changed how they've operated.
Yeah, the groups involved are quite different because the people opposing it here are the fishermen. And oysters, it's the fishermen because they're going to lose territory to it. They're worried about losing territory. If it's not where their territory is, they're very happy to sell the oysters to it because it's a market. So in Delaware Bay, there really wasn't opposition to aquaculture if they could sell directly to it. And it fit in. And so I think that's the only lesson to learn is you have to fit into coastal culture somehow. Coastal culture in Maine is radically different, but you have people from away who move here and live here and love it here. And they're coastal residents now. And you have to, if you're the aquaculture industry, you have to fit into that aesthetic, that not only their environmental needs, but their aesthetic preferences of what they what it looks like. And my understanding of the aquaculture industry in Maine is they've tried really hard to do that, coaching aquaculture fishermen at lease hearings and how you build relationships with the coastal community. My wife, do you know Teresa Johnson? Some of y'all know Teresa. She and I have looked at this in a couple places on the Maine coast, and in Daramuscata, we looked at it where it seems like oyster aquaculture really fits in well with the local aesthetic. They build a lot of relationships with people. Blue Hill Bay, it's a big fight. And it's the same kind of farm. And these are also very sort of gentrified places with a lot of people from away. So yeah, you have to fit in with the local culture and yeah, and some places and oysters did that and some places didn't. Delaware Bay, it did fit, and Chesapeake Bay it didn't. And aquaculture in Maine is the same way. It's a wholly different circumstance, but it's a tough process of trying to fit in with coastal communities.
I'm interested in the sort of professional private societies that you mentioned, like the American Shellfish Society. You mentioned that they were lobbying legislators on behalf of the fisheries and fisheries sciences, but also that they were interested in aquaculture. Is there evidence in the letters of pressure not just on the legislature, but also on the this governing body to push them towards aquaculture? Or did they mostly kind of maintain their focus on the funding sources?
So is there evidence of American Fish Culture Association putting pressure on the Fish Commissioner, U.S. Fish Commissioner?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I don't remember. That's the honest answer. Probably, but I don't remember that letter specifically. I should have brought like a lot of notes of look that up. Yeah, I can't remember if that. So it can't have been common enough for me to include it in the talk. I think I think they were lobbying Congress more than the Fish Commission directly, and that was more of what they were doing. They also lobbied state governments as well, but I think they were more lobbying Congress than the Fish Commission. But that's my memory of it too. Certainly that's, and my knowledge of the National Shellfish Association is better than the Fish Culturalist Association. So I studied the other one much more. But they spent more time lobbying Congress about and state governments about how to fund this, rather than going straight to the fish commissioner and saying, you know, you should do this or this.
Thank you. Mentioned a couple of times the emphasis in several of the reports and so forth on the importance of basic science as the building block for economic development. Is that something that was widely accepted, or was that was that a major challenge because people were always wanting instant gratification? How did that work? Because apparently some basic research persisted.
It was, as far as I can tell, widely accepted among the scientists in the Fish Commission, because they seemed to all, there wasn't sort of someone saying this, you know, we need to focus much more on immediate economic benefits. It was much more about, we need to keep pushing this message and stay on message. We need to keep pushing and promoting this. The basic science will pay off. It is the foundation for long-term economic benefits. But we have to do some things that don't look like they're going to have a benefit in the short term. So they were, the correspondence is them continually saying to each other, we need to push this message. Was it effective? It seems to be, because they continue to put out that kind of science throughout this time period. So they seem to have been effective at lobbying Congress that what they were doing and continued funding for what they were doing was worthwhile. So yeah, but all the letters, they're mainly about like how to do that, and let's keep doing that. And it seems to have been effective. They seem to have been successful at selling that message to Congress.
Might just add something more about David Smith. He also wrote a book about the history of the agricultural experiment station.
Oh, yes.
You probably read that.
Yeah, yeah.
And sort of fits into your story here, because it talked about the development of science here early in the 20th century, when Maine University had a very strong scientific, especially biological, system, with Edith Patch, a later famous entomologist, leading the way, but also scientists such as Raymond Pearl, who was a very famous geneticist at the time, who was studying poultry genetics. And the work that went on in poultry genetics here at the university is the reason we have all these chicken houses all over them. And it was a major thing at the time. But he and some colleagues were very advanced in their work. But when World War I broke out, Raymond Pearl and several other scientists from here were taken away to Washington, and Pearl was put in charge of raising food for the Army for World War I. And so that, you know, University of Maine contributed that in a way that you don't think people today would recognize very much. But it once again shows the value of investing what at the time wasn't very much money in research, but it had huge implications for the state and the nation, really.
Yeah, I'd forgotten about the book on the experiment station, but yeah, that's it. Yeah, definitely worth. I think both those books are worth reading. Right now, we have a lot of challenges. There's people have had challenges in the past year too, and it's worth looking at, learning from their success for sure.
One of the unifying themes that I see in your talk is the archive, beginning with your research into oysters, bringing you to the archive, and then your stated the way you're stating the hope for the university and for funding science is how we re-engage with the archive, the physical archive. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about, you know, possible new ways to approach re-engagement with the physical archive, libraries, etc.
Well, there's probably quite a few, but one thing I think is really interesting, I did mention before that the reports and the bulletins of the U.S. Fish Commission are all online now, which again, to me feels like cheating. Everybody should have to go to DC and suffer as I suffered. I remember very distinctly with one trip with Teresa, her falling asleep. I shouldn't tell the story, but her falling asleep against the photocopier while I made endless photocopies. But you can't afford to stay in DC and read it all. Like the actual correspondence that you have to read in the room, but the other things you can. Anyway, but now that's all digitized. You can see a complete record of U.S. Fish Commission science, all the reports to Congress. So I'd love to teach. I plan to do this when I come back from sabbatical next year. One of these Gen Ed RLE classes. They want to have RL, you know what the RLEs are. They want to have that for Gen Ed classes too. And it couldn't be that more than like 30 people. What I'd have the students do is we call it something like history of environmental science or history of something like that in the US. And I would do lectures on US Fish Commission history or what have you. But the students they'd have to take the Blue Book exam on this. But what they'd do for their project was they would answer a historical question. So, okay, what was the history of seal science like in the early seal science? And I don't know the answer to that as their teacher. I can't tell them. But they could go in the archive and because it's all digital now and find out and reconstruct early seal science, which is kind of like what I did in miniature version, So it just is a fascinating opportunity with the digitization of so many of these agencies' archives. So for students to actually do research they could never do before in a classroom. So I think that I don't know how that fits into anything else I was talking about, but it's something, a way of engaging the archive that didn't exist before, which to me is totally fascinating that you can go and search. I didn't ever do that until COVID hit, and my project I couldn't do anymore. And what am I going to do for research? Then I started exploring the digital archives and realized just how much is out there now, and it's only grown since then. So, I would love to have try that class out in a couple of years, and you can think of how fascinating that'd be for students. They get to reconstruct themselves what actually the progress of whatever. Our knowledge of cod or whatever it was, they can go and investigate it chronologically and see it unfold by discovering it in the archive because you can now do that. And so I don't know, I think it's a really fascinating opportunity. It would be a way for them to learn. They still get the lectures. They still learn the history of the U.S. Fish Commission or USDA or whatever it is, and know something about the institutional. I guess they'll supply the lecture, but then they could do this hands-on exploration of the archive that you can do.
For the letters also, because you said that was important. You still have to go to DC for the letters.
Yeah, that's never been digitized.
You got to go to the Ham Fund or something so you get money to send your whole class down to the archive for some days.
They'd love that, I'm sure. Like 30 students to send on them.
Well, donors sometimes pay for these things. You never know.
No. But it would be worth doing as like just you're there for 2 days, like just to get a feel for it and see what it was like. Because that's a great experience to get to work there for sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank Sam very much for a wonderful talk and a lot of great dialogue. We have 2 minutes till the next talk, so you can get it set up again.
You have to fall asleep on the. I ran out.
If everybody, if your speakers are here, we can go. But then you would have to make separate times for stopping them, so.
Well, before I introduce our first speaker of session 3, I'll remind you all not to run after our last speaker of this session because we will have our group photo before the poster session. So don't forget, stay here just for another minute afterwards. But I'll introduce our first speaker for this session. In progress.
Sorry. Alright.
Still going.
All right, it's my pleasure to introduce Katie Westbrook, who will be presenting on the interhemispheric comparison of the late glacial climate reversal. Welcome, Katie.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. Today, I'm excited to be sharing with you the work that I've been doing, trying to understand what the climate was doing during the termination of the last glacial maximum. The termination of the last glacial maximum is one of the most dramatic climate changes that the Earth has experienced in the recent past, and yet we don't understand what caused it. A key feature of the last glacial termination is a cold reversal that occurred, producing moraines around the globe, such as these ones in southwestern Norway. You can see Trish and I are standing on one moraine ridge, and there's another just behind us. The climate driver that produced these moraines is still unknown, and so I will be hopefully contributing some data to that question. So if you will come with me on this journey, I would like to take us to Norway. Okay. Maybe. Okay, well, we are now zoomed in to southwestern Norway to a place called Lysefjord. Lysefjord is 30 miles long, and the fjord walls are over 3,000 feet high, and at its deepest points, it's 1,000 feet deep. During the last glacial maximum, the Scandinavian ice sheet extended over the Scandinavian continent and onto the continental shelf outside of Norway, and at some point retreated to Lysefjord, where it paused to produce moraines during the cold reversal. Determining exactly when this cold reversal occurred in Norway will allow us to compare to other data sets around the world to hopefully try to figure out what caused the cold reversal in the first place. So here's a photograph of Lysefjord. You can see the beautiful granite walls surrounding the fjord that are glacially scoured from being covered in several glaciations over the last 2.5 million years. In the foreground, you'll see the ice contact slope of a moraine that was deposited during the cold reversal of the last termination. To figure out when this cold reversal occurred, I'll be using a method called exposure age dating. This method relies on taking a piece of rock from a boulder that was deposited by ice and counting the amount of beryllium atoms in that boulder. Those beryllium atoms have been accumulating in the boulder since it was deposited by ice. And so retracing where ice was will give us an idea of what climate was doing. And if we do that in enough places, then we can get an idea of what the global climate was doing. So here's a 1 meter resolution LiDAR photograph of Lysefjord mouth. You'll see on this side of the fjord, there are 3 distinct moraine ridges that trace along to the other side and connects to the valley adjacent to it. During the late glacial period, ice would have filled in the valley like this. So ice would have been flowing from the top of the page to this terminal point in this glacier, producing the moraines that you see here. So
Lisa Fjord is an ideal place to do this kind of work because it's downwind of the North Atlantic. The glacier that produced these moraines was directly influenced by the condition of the North Atlantic. And the glacial geology here is very well preserved, unlike a lot of places in the world. And so it's a worthwhile place to do this kind of work. I'm going to drop our Google Earth Street View pin to show you a photograph from this location facing down toward the mouth of the moraine. So here are what the moraines look like in person. You can see the three that I had pointed out on the previous photograph, as well as two grad students in the middle for scale. So going and collecting samples from moraines can tell us when the ice front was stable and producing moraines. If we walk kind of into the page and to the right, we'll enter this field area where this photograph was taken, where there are erratic boulders, which tell you where the ice front was and when. And then if you turned back and went further down the moraines, there we will get to this location where I took these photographs of boulder moraines. So still also moraines, just lacking the fine grain matrix. They're just a really fun sight to see in person. And they were subject to speculation of early Norwegians who thought that they were produced by trolls, for lack of a better explanation at the time. So here's the data set that I have accumulated so far. I have 50 boulder ages, so ages of individual boulders. And as much as I wish I could sit here and talk about every single one, I have to find some way to summarize this data. And so I'm grouping the ages by landform. So I have grouped them to show their arithmetic mean based on the landform. So from the outside, I have outer erratic boulders that tell us that the Scandinavian ice sheet retreated from its last glacial maximum point to Lisa Fjord by 15,000 years ago. And then the Scandinavian ice front stayed in Lisa Fjord to produce moraines, 3 separate ones at 13,400 years ago, 12,900 years ago, and 12,700 years, before the inerratics indicate that it receded further up the fjord afterwards. And if that was a lot to remember, then I'll try to clue you into one key point, and that's that moraines were constructed in Lisa Fjord at 13,400 years ago to 12,800 years ago. And this is when the cold reversal occurred in Norway. And for sake of time, I'm going to blast through that, sorry. So moving to the southern hemisphere to a new field area in the southern island of New Zealand is a place called Chop Creek, where I've done the same methodology to compare what the two hemispheres were doing climatically. So we're at this point in the South Island in New Zealand, and this is the Tasman Valley that's surrounded by a late glacial ice margin that I wish I could run over and point out, but I can't. And I'd like to zoom into this point where the ice front was. Here you can see the Birch Hill Moraine Complex coming across the screen like that, as well as a tributary valley of the Tasman Valley, where a glacier would have been overrunning and adding into that glacier. So these are the dates that I have for that area so far. You can see that the Birch Hill Moraine Complex was constructed between about 12,500 years ago and 14,200, as well as the tributary valley of the Birch Hill Moraines at about 12,000, 13,000 years ago. And then just outside of those moraines
Some older ages indicate that the ice front had retreated from its last glacial maximum position to this point by 15,000 years ago. And if the ages look familiar, they should, because they seem to indicate that the ice front was stable and producing moraines in New Zealand at the same time that the Scandinavian ice sheet was. So in conclusion, the Scandinavian ice margin retreated to Lisa Fjord mouth by about 16,000 years ago, was stable in producing moraines from about 13,700 years ago to 12,800 years ago. The synchronicity with New Zealand indicates that the climate driver that produced these moraines was a global event. I would like to thank my funders for their generous support and my lab group for their additional support. And I'm happy to take your questions.
How do these dates compare to those of the Loch Lomond Ray bands and work in that area?
That's in Scotland?
Yes.
They're very, very similar. Within uncertainty, I think the Loch Lomond advanced at the same time as the Scandinavian ice sheet. Any other questions? Yeah.
Is your like field research going out and taking the samples concluded at this point, or what's sort of the next steps?
Good question. If I can find generous support for another field venture, I would love to go back to Norway and collect more rocks there, but as of now, we'll see. I have plenty to keep me busy. Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
One moment, please. Alrighty, so I'm excited to introduce Nestor Walters, who will be speaking on Toward New Ceremonies, COP30 Reflections on Ancestral and Artificial Intelligence. Get away, Nestor.
Thank you, Kaylee. Good afternoon, everyone. Last year in June, when I first came to UMaine, I came across a passage in a book that described Nunamiut hunter as perceiving the same landscape as an old wolf. I am a first-year PhD student. My background is in math, and the project that I'm under is, in so many words, investigating the effects of changing temperature and precipitation regimes on Arctic landscapes and modeling those landscapes. So I became very interested to know whether a machine intelligence, an artificial intelligence, could learn a similar intuition of the landscape that was described about this Nunamiut hunter. This led me in part to join a delegation from UMaine that attended the UN climate negotiations in Belém, Brazil. And one of the events, the first event actually that I found myself in, was this opening ceremony for the Resilience Pavilion. And it happened to be a ceremony that was where there were 6 speakers from 6 indigenous tribes around the world. I have not listed their names or tribal affiliations here because I don't know, I didn't get to speak to them or have their consent. But they left a strong impression on me, especially this concept of ancestral intelligence. And I would like to take the next few minutes to describe to you a few examples of how this influenced my work here. We developed a graph neural network that was able to read the signals in a retreating glacier basin and translate that to changes in the surrounding landscape. There are theoretical mathematical systems that are particularly primed to process and encode the types of qualitative observations that are typically seen in these knowledge systems. And the possibility of language that has been explored by some chemical engineers and self-taught linguists who believe that some certain kinds of indigenous language, their verb structures, some of them describe the natural world the same way we do, but entirely without a concept of time as we know it. And that has possibilities to, that's not what this quote is related to, but I see possibilities there to explore questions that are baffling the edge of our knowledge in things like relativity and string theory and quantum mechanics. That actually, maybe I should not have said string theory, but relativity and quantum mechanics that do depend on our concept of time and velocity. Finally, I would like to discuss these three concepts that or these three paths that I've come across through the literature. One being the ancestral forms of intelligence, one being the sort of process-based science that we're used to, and one being these machine intelligences that we tend not to trust because we don't understand them, but we also, in many cases, don't understand ourselves. And the possibility that there are connections that are occurring in science between some of these, but there is a missing piece, even though these systems of knowledge seem to have a lot of overlap by perceiving relationships and looking for clusters of information and the attention to correlation. If I did this, however, I would be trying to justify the validity of one system of reasoning and perceiving the world and understanding purely based on the logical systems and logical pathways of an entirely different, although perhaps not entirely distinct system. And besides being intellectually dishonest, this has been proven by Gödel to be logically unsound, logically impossible. So instead, I will tell you two stories about coyote that I have come across in a book by Ordos and Ortiz. In the first story, the Nez Perce Indians of the Blue Mountains in what is now eastern Washington and Oregon were tormented by these 7 giants. The giants were devouring the children, and Coyote got together all the clawed animals, so the mountain lions, the bears, the mice, the voles, and they dug 7 very, very deep pits, filled them with this red-yellow liquid that they made boiling with hot stones. And the next time the giants came, they fell into the pits, and then Coyote turned them into what are now the 7 Devils Mountains. And the red-yellow liquid became the copper that is still being mined. In the second story, Coyote travels to different communities. He gives deer to some people, salmon to others, and at some point takes a wife And the father of this wife keeps trying to kill Coyote. And the fourth time that this happens, Coyote turns into a wren to escape. And then they're on a canoe, and Coyote carves a small sculpture of a killer whale from a soft piece of wood, throws it into the water, and that whale jumps out of the water and devours that pernicious father-in-law from the canoe. Now, it's easy to dismiss these stories as superstition or mythology, but when we do so, we ignore the fact that for thousands of years, these stories have been sustaining the people of the lands where Coyote walked and Eagle flies and still walks in many ways to this day. And when we think about what Professor Haynes just talked about, the possibilities of growing from a crisis, what could that mean? When we look back at, I will say, our scientific ancestors, the Pythagoreans were mystics. Sir Isaac Newton studied alchemy, and that was not the alchemy that we think of trying to turn mercury into gold as a cheap trick. It was the alchemy of transforming the body and the self into something that is in tune and whole with the universe. And Albert Einstein has a well-known quote talking about the perception of the individual as being something that is an illusion caused by consciousness, and that the prime motive should be to rid ourselves of that illusion. In this way, then, the true possibility or gift seems to me to be beyond the elders giving us data about ice breakoff or even about some vegetation proliferation so that people can put them into models and the models are slightly better. But it is the possibility of seeing trees as fellow beings, of feeling the land grow in our flesh and the ocean pump through our arteries and veins. And so now my question has become whether a machine intelligence can learn that intuition. Xander?
Great talk. When it comes to defining what a machine can learn, how would the user be able to differentiate between if it's actually learning or just being able to convince us that it is? And does that inherently matter for what we want to accomplish with the AI?
I think that's a very good question, and it touches on some very deep philosophical questions, both about what we call artificial intelligence and about what we call our own intelligence. Because if you look at how a child grows and how a child starts to sort of represent its learning, I mean, how many of us in school recited things just so we could get a grade and maybe go home and get a Shiner prize? But even that is part of learning and is part of growth. So, and then I think the other really good point you made is that this really depends on what we are asking for it and hoping to learn, or hoping. To me, the possibilities of machine intelligences are not to process faster or more resolutely things that we already know and are already processing. It is to be able to perceive relations and correlations that we cannot. Yes.
In 1959, the mathematician Eugene Wigner gave a talk at New York University, entitled The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Science. And he pointed out what seems on the face of it kind of amazing that mathematics can predict all kinds of things, particles and so forth. And it actually is one of the astounding things about the way the world works, that mathematics and the rest of nature work together this way. Do you see what you're trying to do here as an extension of that idea?
I think everything we do is extensions of ideas that have come before. And it seems that mathematics are inherently all about relations. When we think of a proton and an electron, we visualize them as particles, but it's really just a relationship of one having more mass and one having a different charge that we express mathematically. And at our scale, we see ourselves as, beings, and it's all these relations inside us. And then on the scale of galaxies, we might be protons and electrons. Our planets might be.
Thank you so much, Nestor. All right, so our next round of talks are each 5 minutes long with 1 minute for questions. So we'll have probably fewer question opportunities. But our next speaker here is Thatcher Carter, presenting on internationally transferred migration outcomes and the land conservation at COP30 Amazon.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Thatcher. I am a 2L at the University of Maine School of Law, so I feel very out of my element here a little bit. It's been cool though to learn about all the more scientific based presentations, and Nestor, your presentation was fantastic. So yeah, I was one of 5 at the COP30 Amazonia in Brazil this year through the United Nations. And I went to law school with a background in land conservation work. So I really came to law school interested in environmental law, and then a specific focus on how land use and conservation can sort of act as a climate change solution. Belém is often described as the gateway to the Amazon, the city where this conference was held. So it's right next to a 6.7 million square kilometer rainforest that holds around 400 billion trees and stores between 150 and 200 billion tons of carbon. So especially from the perspective of someone with my research interests, it felt like a great setting for me and for the conference as a whole. I attended a lot of different sessions at the conference, and one that stuck with me was on Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement. So COP30 was sort of billed as the implementation COP, and consistent with that theme, the conference had various ambition dialogues where representatives from countries all over the world would come together and talk about implementation of the Paris Agreement. And one of those was on Article 6.2, which in effect is a provision that enables sort of a global carbon credit market system, sort of an emission reduction trading credit system. By its language, the article allows countries to voluntarily participate in what are called internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, or ITMOs. And they participate in those arrangements to help achieve their nationally determined contributions, which are also called NDCs, or sort of country-specific commitments to emission reduction. So you do ITMOs to reach your NDCs. So an example of this, just sort of to illustrate, would be, country A develops solar panels, and then country A enters into an arrangement with country B to transfer those emissions reductions to country B for country B to count them towards its self-proclaimed NDC. And at the conference, we heard from a number of different countries: South Korea, Australia, Japan, and they all sort of shared lessons learned from their participation or lack thereof in this sort of emission reduction trading regime. Another issue that was discussed a good amount is double counting. So carbon credit markets and systems like this are not without controversy, and an issue that comes up is this thing called double counting. That would be essentially in the example that I just provided, where country A and country B would both be counting the emissions reductions from their solar panels to the NDC, when in reality it should only be the receiving country, so country B, which was on the receiving end of the international arrangement. Article 6.2, by its language, tries to minimize this practice. It calls for robust accounting and insurance against double counting. And this was another issue that was discussed in pretty good depth at these ambition dialogues. So sort of tying this experience back to my research interests in land conservation, I'm now looking into to what extent natural resource protection can serve as an ITMO under the Paris Agreement. And it turns out that it can serve as sort of the basis for one of these arrangements, and it is sort of increasingly being used in that way. So for instance, in 2025, Singapore announced its plans to procure 2.17 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent in credits to help reach its NDC. And all of those are being sourced from natural resource protection initiatives in Peru, Paraguay, and Ghana. So going into my last year of law school, I'll be taking a few international law courses, and I'm hoping to, in the future, author sort of a full-length research paper on this topic. Thank you for listening.
I was interested in how the equity of that arrangement is specifically of those natural resource protections are approached when the natural resources are kind of disparate. I mean, all of the different countries that you listed involved in this particular scheme have very different natural resources and different natural resource protection needs. So how would you go about equating those things when it's across continents and across development levels?
Yeah, I will report back to you next year once I dive into this a little bit more. But yeah, it all comes down to some sort of calculation on CO2 equivalent. But of course, what you said still stands. So I'll definitely, look into that a little bit more.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
And welcome to our next speaker, Stephanie Forbes, speaking on the technological innovation through COP's technology mechanism, balancing mitigation and monitoring effects with long-term impact.
All right, thank you. I'm also a second-year law student at the University of Maine and attended the COP30 conference down in Belém, Brazil, along with my colleagues. And while there are a plethora of things that we could all each be talking about based on the conference, one that really struck with me and I think is particularly impactful and in line with my research is technology. So first, I guess taking a step back, one of the things that you may or may not know about is back last year in July of 2025, the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion, basically stating that states have obligations in regards to climate change, and they have obligations to comply with their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, as Thatcher discussed. So that and a lot of similar decisions around the world and regional courts frame some of the conversations, at least in my mind and my perspective, approaching and entering into the conference. And this is a big win for small countries that are in need of development and need of repayment in terms of the climate damage that has been done to them. But it's also a big blow to large polluting countries. So one of the things that the negotiations and such centered around was, how do we take this and implement this, as Thatcher said, as the conference, the COP of implementation. And one of the ways in which the conference focused on doing that is through technology. So back in, I believe, 2010, there's a technology mechanism that was lumped in as part of these negotiations. And with it, there was a technology executive committee and the Climate Technology Center Network that were created to develop recommendations and policy proposals, along with a slew of negotiations amongst countries to figure out how to use technology to continue driving innovation and fighting climate change, particularly in some of those least developed countries throughout the global south. While technology does offer lots of possibilities, as we've talked a lot with artificial intelligence and things like that, there are also harms to it that often don't make it to parts of these conversations. So in my perspective and some of the research that I do down in Portland at the University of Maine, I do a lot of research on privacy, technology ethics, and the environmental impact of technology, like artificial intelligence. And while those topics cropped up here and there throughout the conference, technology as a predominantly driving innovator is still the main theme and still the main focus, which I think is true and I think it's important. But in my research, I have found that it's also important to balance that with some of the concerns around ethics and data sovereignty, digital colonialism, as well as the environmental impact of data centers and things like that. So one thing I noticed in my listening of negotiations was that a lot of the implementation was to be led by localities, which mitigates some of the concerns around ethics and data sovereignty, digital colonialization that a lot of least developed countries and global south countries can face through technology implementation that's particularly funded by larger developed countries, predominantly China, actually. But another thing that was less sort of discussed at this point at an international level is the environmental impact of technology itself. And there's still a lack of funding and a lack of sustainable and a lack of funding just generally, I think, in the technology implementation realm, but particularly in a sustainable implementation realm. And there's a lot of questions and things that still need to be worked out. But I guess the thing that I kind of left the conference with, and this relates back to Professor Haynes' opening, is technology driving change, or is technology kind of creating the crisis that will eventually lead us to change as a result of kind of changing how we implement technology and think about it as a blanket solution to everything? So yeah, thank you. Yes, that's right.
You brought up a lot of things that I think about a lot, and I'm wondering how wide your net of technology expands. In particular, I'm thinking about things like food industry and garments, all that, like shipping something across the ocean to come to us, things like that.
Yeah. I mean, I think in terms of it broadly, I think there's room for sustainable practices to be increased throughout pretty much, I'd say, with almost any technology that we're thinking of. There's room for increasing sustainable practices throughout supply chain or whatever it may be throughout the COP conference, and in terms of technology as a implementation mechanism to fight climate change. I think there were just different tools that were talked about there, and kind of more so in like a water treatment sense or monitoring sense and things like that. But in the way I think about it, I kind of think about it broadly and everything. And I think that you make a good point that technology itself is a broad term, and I think the conference approaches it as broad. And now moving forward, I think artificial intelligence is the thing that people think about. But there is more to it than that. Technology is just kind of a broad term there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Our next speaker is Adam Fortier-Brown with the talk title of COP30, Turning Promises into Action, sort of.
Thank you. Before I start, I just want to say thank you to the Climate Change Institute for supporting our ability to the University of Maine's School of Law's ability to attend this conference. It's a tremendous impact on our education to be able to go and be a part of these negotiations and sit in on them, we never would have been able to do it without the support here, particularly of Professors Eisenhower and Stanweiss. So before I get into it, I just want to say thank you.
The funding for you to go came from Dan Churchill, our #1 donor, who I believe is in the room.
Is Dan Churchill in the room?
Yeah.
Well, I want to say thank you. So,
It's incredibly generous and it makes a tremendous impact. So thank you, seriously. Who here likes Anthony Bourdain? Okay, I thought I might get more hints, but if you'd like to see what Belem looks like, he has a great episode of it, No Reservations, and I only watched it like 4 or 5 times on the flight there because we had plenty of time to do so. But it's a fantastic city, and they've come a long way. So Belem, as some of my colleagues have already discussed, was really about where the rubber meets the road and about implementation. So if Paris, if we remember that, was about agreeing conceptually to the what, to what is the issue, how are we going to, get there, right? With the nationally determined contributions, those are the nation's climate plans that you'll hear about, climate action plans, and national adaptation policies. So the climate plans are all about how are we reducing our impact on climate change for the future? And adaptation plans are how am I becoming more resilient and less vulnerable to the impacts of climate change today? What Belem was really focused on was, among other things, was about how do we measure that progress and how do we know whether we're actually moving the needle and actually doing anything that's meaningful in this space. That's what my research covered, and it was an incredibly contentious couple weeks focused on the global goal on adaptation indicators. It started a couple of years ago at a COP where scientists proposed 10,000 indicators, and it was reduced down to 100 indicators to actually discuss. And the reason why was politics and convenience so that they could negotiate every single one. And they did go through every single one line by line to try and negotiate that. They ended up adopting under the gavel 59 indicators, despite significant objections from the European Union, the Latin American group, Canada, and Australia. The idea, that's kind of why we say sort of, right? It's like we didn't adopt the full 100. We didn't adopt what we were looking to do. But there's some sort of stake in the ground to work from and some sort of foundation to build from in terms of how we're measuring progress. So what those indicators look like is they're going to measure the adaptation for, food systems, water security, public health, the strength of ecosystems, the strength of infrastructure, and the impacts of poverty. It excludes some really important indicators as well, like transboundary risks. So it treats these climate risks as if climate change stops at the nation's border, when we all know it doesn't. It also fails to account for the impacts that climate change has on driving vulnerability globally and driving conflict globally. I mean, we see that all over the world. And it fails to account for financial contributions that developed nations have already said that they're going to contribute, but it fails to account for whether or not they're actually meeting those financial obligations. So progress is being made on this, and I would contend that this is going to be a significant part of future COP negotiations to determine really what's going on. It's not the prettiest and the most newsworthy thing, so to speak. So the political incentives there are few and far between in terms of getting a big Paris deal. But this is really where the rubber meets the road, and I'd be happy to answer any questions at this point about some of the negotiations we were able to sit in on. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Adam. And our final presenter for this section is Kieran Lorenzen, presenting on how COP30 represents and fails to represent the islands on the front lines of climate change.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here and the funding to go to this conference, which was truly foundational in our study of international environmental law and how these policies actually get made. COP30, 30th Conference of Parties in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I am from Maine originally. I went to law school to study coastal land use, to study the environmental impact that we have on our coastlines. In Maine, we are heavily reliant on coastal industry. And so going internationally, I thought that a good idea would be to examine how other countries that rely on coastal industry are impacted by climate change and the solutions that they are using to deal with the problems that we'll be facing in the future. And in that research, I learned about one of the most vulnerable populations internationally that is facing threats from climate change is AOSIS. AOSIS is a negotiating bloc within the COP30. It stands for the Alliance of Small Island States. Small Island Developing States, or SIDS. We love our acronyms in environmental law. SIDS are one of the most vulnerable populations in the world. Because not only are they struggling economically, they don't have the wealth that nations have to adapt to the effects of climate change. They also don't have a lot of elevation above sea level, which, as we know, sea level rise is a big problem, especially when your elevation over sea level is in single or double digits. So AOSIS is a unique negotiating bloc in COP30 because they are a very small portion of the Earth's population, but they are an outsized voice because they have to be. Because AOSIS uses this term, the ambition gap, in this COP of implementation, this COP that discusses a lot about ambition. How are we going to actually make the rubber meet the road? How are we going to implement nationally determined contributions that people have promised, that these states have promised to implement? Well, it turns out that a lot of those promises are falling short. And there's also an increased emphasis on adaptation efforts as opposed to mitigation efforts, which, when it comes to small island developing states, those adaptation efforts are few and far between. There's only so many ways that you can adapt to your country potentially being underwater in 50 years. So this negotiating bloc has become an outsized voice in COP30 because they are encouraging nations with the wealth and the ability to actually implement mitigation efforts on climate change, to hold up their end of the deal. Those nations that have historically benefited from fossil fuel extraction are the ones that are most at fault for climate change and the state of the world today. And so AOSIS is trying to hold those nations responsible. Now, we've seen in the most recent round of NDCs that around 74% of nations that submitted their NDCs also had strong adaptation efforts within those NDCs, which is an attractive option for nations with the money to be able to implement those kinds of adaptation efforts, but ultimately doesn't help the rest of the world. It is it's a domestic issue. So there's not really a conclusion to this struggle, but it is a continuing dynamic that we see in international negotiations, where those that are the most impacted by climate change and those that stand to lose the most are also those with the least bargaining power. And those that have the most bargaining power are also the ones who have the least actual incentive to participate effectively in these negotiations. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Like, say one.
Yeah.
And that is just that I'm very glad that all of you went. It's and you're coming back to talk about it. Because at a time when our country is failing to meet its obligation to the world as one of the biggest producers of carbon dioxide, and yet one that's dragging its feet and not performing. It's great to see that, we're pushing back a little bit. There's some Americans going there and playing a role and coming back and talking about it. So well done.
Thank you. And it's also important to say that there was a big elephant in the room, or not in the room at this COP, because this was the first COP that the United States did not send a delegation to. So four of us were a big portion of the US delegation to COP30. So thank you again for the opportunity to attend this conference.
Don't forget Nestor.
Oh, sorry, it's the five of us. Yeah, Nestor. Sorry about that. Yeah, Nestor.
Yeah, this isn't quite a question, but I just really appreciated the connection you made between coast of Maine and these small island states. And it reminded me of a quote that stuck with me from one of the presentations I attended that was on migrations driven by climate change. And the speaker said that we are all closer to being refugees than millionaires. We here probably have more in common with the people in the small island states than with some others.
I'll let that point stand on its own. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Let's give all of the speakers. Please, everybody come up for the picture. No, it's everybody.